4:33 a.m., November 17th, Montgomery County, Indiana. A male 911 dispatcher answers a 911 call. What's the location of the emergency? In an eerily calm voice, a woman slumped on a sofa, blood running down her neck, replies, 203 South Madison Street. In what town, he asks. Darlington, she says. Then with no hint of remorse, she explains why she's calling. She has stabbed herself and her 2 children. This is just one of the Reddit-infused tales of horror and tragedy you'll hear, along with even more disturbing ones in today's episode of the Infographics Show. The worst crimes in Reddit history. Number 6. Malignant Mother. The woman's name is Brandy Worley. As she spoke with the dispatcher, her unsettling composure never wavered, but then she said something that caught him off guard. Her husband was asleep downstairs in the basement, completely unaware of what had just happened. Meanwhile, upstairs, she stated coldly, "There's blood everywhere." The sleeping husband was Jason Worley, but to the Reddit community he was known as Jason in Hell. Why in hell? Well, because he had made the mistake of marrying the wrong woman. Before the murders, Jason had already turned to strangers for help. On the subreddit Relationship Advice, he'd written a post under the title, "I'm 30 male, having a hard time coping with my wife, 29 female, having cheated on me with our neighbor, 51 male." In his post, Jason explained that in 2015, more than a year earlier, he had been working exhausting 60-hour weeks as a software engineer. He was focused on providing for his family, unaware that his skills would soon reveal the truth about the woman he had married. He also admitted his long hours had kept him away from the 2 people that mattered most, his children, Tyler, 7, and Charlie, 3. After marrying in 2009, life had been good for a few years. But during the stressful days of his 12-hour shifts, Jason began noticing a change in Brandy. One day, he picked up her phone and saw she had set a password. That struck him as a red flag since she had always been open about her social media activity. She told him she was planning a big Father's Day surprise and didn't want him spoiling it by stumbling upon her messages. Jason didn't press the issue. After all, relationships are built on trust, right? About a week later, Brandy told him she'd been feeling guilty about hiding things from him. She came clean, hoping to ease his suspicion. Brandy revealed the surprise. She had hired their neighbor and friend, a construction contractor, to build an extension on the house, a personal office just for Jason, the workspace he'd always wanted. Jason wanted to believe her, but the locked phone nagged at him, a lingering doubt that festered in the back of his mind, one he just couldn't shake. In the weeks that followed, Brandy would tap out messages on her phone, a grin flickering across her face, like a teenager feeling the first flutters of young love. She was hiding something from him. He knew it. One day, Jason saw his chance. As soon as Brandy stepped into the shower, he grabbed her phone before the lock screen could activate and opened her messages. There it was, a text from Brandy to the neighbor, flirty and suggestive. That was the only incriminating message, but at the time, Jason didn't know that Brandy had her messaging app set to message self-destruct mode. He wrote on Reddit over a year later, "I felt uncomfortable with it, but I knew she had a perverted sense of humor, and I thought she would never do anything to hurt me." Meanwhile, Jason's new office project seemed to drag on endlessly. Progress was slow, and despite never considering himself the jealous type, he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that Brandy was cheating on him. Then he got another chance to check her phone. This time, he looked at her Google timeline. Strange, he thought. There were huge gaps in her location history. He later told his fellow Redditors, "At this point, the paranoia was driving me nuts." He had a plan. He told Brandy about a great new antivirus software, and Brandy, not wanting to raise suspicion, or maybe she was just naive, agreed to install it on her phone. Except what Jason actually installed was software he could use to remotely turn on her GPS. He also set up an AT&T message backup system, which he could access from his own devices. As for this neighbor who would always seem to be at Jason's house when he got home, he had a girlfriend of his own and a son from a previous marriage. The 2 neighbors were on very friendly terms. The kids sometimes hung out together. Jason even designed his construction website, which ironically stated in the bio it was, quote, "committed to building lasting relationships," and we guess breaking them too. But this neighbor of course had no idea what Brandy was capable of. One day, the neighbor's girlfriend and Brandy went to see a movie together while the men agreed to stay at Jason's place with the kids. The 3 children played video games together upstairs in Tyler's bedroom as the neighbor sat opposite Jason on the sofa. During their conversation and the TV entertainment, the neighbor would keep checking his phone. He'd smile and send a message, and all that time with Jason watching out of the corner of his eye and intermittently checking his own phone. He was reading the messages just as soon as Brandy sent them to the man sitting across from him. She was telling the neighbor what sex acts she wanted to perform on him, to which the neighbor reciprocated with his own lurid sexual fantasies. Jason could not believe what he was reading. "You're my girl now," wrote the neighbor, to which Brandy replied, "Always have been, and always will be." They agreed to meet on Monday morning just as soon as Jason went to work. It was the final straw. So when Brandy and the neighbor's girlfriend got back from the theater, laughing and joking about the movie, Magic Mike XXL, Jason was waiting. Brandy's smile vanished as she lowered herself onto the sofa, the laughter of their kids playing upstairs cutting through the thick, awkward silence. Jason looked at Brandy, and then at the neighbor, then back at both of them. "So, you two love each other, huh?" What ensued was a volley of recriminations and pathetic denials, followed by the indisputable evidence being laid before the cheating couple's eyes. Jason explained on Reddit, "The neighbors went home and my wife and I argued for the rest of the night about what we were going to do. The next day, Monday, the day that Brandy and the neighbor had planned their tryst, Jason was in a meeting when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Brandy. She said that she was sitting at home telling the kids that Mommy and Daddy were splitting up because Daddy was mad at her. Jason could hear them crying in the background. He felt awful. His whole life was about protecting those children from harm, and now they were being told that he was going to abandon them." He said on Reddit, "It was at that moment I realized she was going to drag the kids through hell if I left her. So I swallowed my feelings and begged her to stay." It seems he shouldered some of the blame himself. He'd obviously been working too much, not doing enough to make Brandy a happy wife. For a while, things seemed fine. Jason tried to move past it. But then, almost exactly a year after the Magic Mike truth bomb on the sofa, it happened again. A message, an image. Brandy, smiling seductively, completely naked, below it a very suggestive text, sent to the neighbor. It was an accident, she claimed, meant for Jason, not for him. Jason so much wanted to believe this, but he couldn't sleep at night. It's all he ever thought about. He wanted a divorce, but he still wasn't sure. So that's when he posted for the first time on Reddit. Towards the end of the post, he wrote, "I am afraid that after this much time and the fact that I begged her back, that to say that I want a divorce now would only make her more vindictive toward my children." So he talked about marriage counseling, but Brandy didn't want to go. After all, she was the guilty party and she would have some explaining to do. Instead, she told Jason that he'd never see the kids again if he left, and she'd tell the courts that he'd self-harmed in school, so he wasn't a stable parent. Jason wrote in an updated post, "She gives me an ultimatum to decide what I'm going to do, or she will decide for me." He received a lot of support from Redditors. Everyone said the same. "Get away. Get out. She is toxic. The kids will realize that one day. She is guilt-tripping you to stay." Jason replied to this mountain of supportive correspondence with the words, "I'm going to get myself and my kids out. I meet with an attorney next week. Thank you everyone for helping." You're going to see some horror stories later when social media is a catalyst for pure evil. But for Jason, it was a godsend. It worked. And then, on that very same thread, just weeks later, a user saw something on the local news. A local Montgomery news website ran the headline, "Mother admits killing 2 young children." Yellow tape was wrapped around the house. The family minivan was still parked in the driveway. Thoughts and prayers were issued by members of the public as they threw hate in the direction of Brandy, the woman who had told the dispatcher that night, "My husband divorced me and wanted to take my kids. I won't let him have my kids." Jason had filed for divorce a day earlier, and on the night of the slaying, he'd thrown the papers down in front of her as the kids slept upstairs. Brandy had asked him to sleep on the sofa, but he decided the air mattress in the basement was a better option. Was she planning to murder him too? Upstairs in her daughter's bedroom, Brandy had hidden a combat knife that she'd bought earlier from Walmart. In the early morning hours, she woke up her son and told him they were going to have a fun sleepover in his sister's room. He followed her without question. As they sat on the bed, she plunged the knife into his neck. Charlie awoke and, confused and scared, she asked Mommy what she was doing. Brandy told her to go back to sleep. Once Tyler was dead, she turned the knife on her now sleeping daughter. After the murders, Brandy picked up the phone and called the mother-in-law. Moments later, she arrived at the house only to be met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Her screams shattered the silence, jolting Jason awake in the basement. He rushed upstairs only to find his mother in the kitchen, crying and distraught, and Brandy in the living room, blood dripping down her neck. She glared at him and growled in a voice subdued by the Benadryl she'd taken, "Now you can't take my children from me." Her injuries were far from life-threatening. She'd gone much softer on her own throat than she had on her kids. She was later sentenced to 120 years, and it was all because she enjoyed cheating on her husband. A husband who had said one last thing on Reddit, a piece of advice about bringing up children. Always make sure they know how much you love them. I had the fortune that the last thing my children ever heard me say was, "I love you, good night. I will see you in the morning." That is a terrifying and sad story, and so is this next one, but it's also incredibly confounding. Number 5. The Office and Futility. Saturday, April 3rd, 2021, Allen, Texas. Around 1 a.m., police officers responded to a reported disturbance at a large red brick home on the 1500 block of Pine Bluff Drive. Inside, they found an affluent Bangladeshi family, bullet holes riddling their bodies. That house had once been a home and was now a crime scene. A grandmother, a husband and wife, Tauhid and Irene, their daughter, Tanvir, and alongside them their 2 sons, Farbin and Farhan. Both were bright, capable young men who in slightly different circumstances might have had a promising future. Back in 2020, a post on Reddit asked if you could push a button and someone in the world died but you got $1 million, would you push it? User Galpticos replied, "I would push it 7 billion times." The user was a self-confessed former A-grade student who frequently shared his struggles on Reddit. He described how depression first took hold in high school and followed him throughout college. This was the same boy who once wrote that he was privileged to live in a great country with, as he put it, a good family, a good home. He had friends, opportunities, everything that should have made him happy. But he didn't feel happy, he felt useless. And worst of all, he didn't know why. He responded to many posts about mental health, once saying, being born was the most unfair thing that had ever happened to him. He'd make such serious and worrying comments between incessantly talking about Fortnite and writing about the difficulty of Mario Kart's Rainbow Road. There was something revealing about his favorite topics, depression, racing with Donkey Kong and Yoshi, and the weight of an existential futility. He was like a child, desperately trying to tear off his youth, stepping into an adult world he wasn't ready to wear. He wouldn't be the only 18-year-old who felt this way, but Galpticos felt like he was alone in his suffering, and that made all the difference. Galpticos was actually Farhan Tauhid, one of the 2 sons found dead in that house. Farhan had enrolled in college, but that didn't last long. After being evicted from his dorm, he dropped out and moved back with his family. Gaming, Reddit, and writing filled his time, but his greatest love seemed to be The Office, which he once described as one of the 4 very important issues of his life. But once he had seen every episode, he decided there was nothing left for him to do. He was furious about the later seasons, claiming the character development and plot lines had pushed him over the edge. So Farhan told his brother that life was futile, to which his brother seems to have agreed. They made a pact: if they couldn't find a reason to live within a year, they would kill their entire family. During this time of seeking, Farhan still wrote on Reddit, one time saying that the hardest problem he had to solve in life was finding the motivation to wake up each day. In 2021, he posted a note on Instagram explaining that by the time anyone read it, his entire family would be dead. He talked about reaching his breaking point and the fact that he wanted to become a programming god but had failed. He couldn't understand how to be happy. How did everyone else do it? Working, sleeping, maintaining relationships, while he felt like he was drowning in futility. There's a lot more I want to say, but hey, life's short, he wrote. Then he picked up a gun he noted was disturbingly easy for his brother to purchase, and killed his entire family. But why? Why kill them? He'd written in his note, "I love my family, I genuinely do. That is exactly why I decided to kill them." In his dark, twisted embrace of antinatalist logic, he believed that he was saving them from the pain of existence itself. For Farhan, this was the only tragic way out, for him and for them. As for the next story, it's about something far more disturbing than philosophical despair. Number 4. 5 minutes of fame for a lifetime in prison. 10 years ago, Reddit user Brian W. 1999 asked the question on the subreddit Frugal, "Is remaining child-free the most frugal way to be?" One of the replies was from the user Aoki Mom. "I have 7 children and we always have lived on one income and have never got any government assistance or needed it. The answer to life's difficulties," she said, "was making good choices and knowing what to do with your money." She added, "I would never give up having any of my children, so I could have more money. They are amazing people and the world will benefit by having them in it." 7 years later, someone wrote below, "Wow, this is a hard comment to read." Another person just said, "Poor lady, Aoki Mom was really April Beaver." On July 22, 2015, in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, she was found dead in her home, her body covered in wounds and bruises. Her husband David had suffered a similarly brutal fate. He had been savagely beaten and stabbed 28 times across his hands, arms, face, head, and neck. This wasn't just a murder, it was overkill. Not long before this, April had been on Reddit again, writing, "I got married in Texas in 1987, still married to the same guy, and 7 kids later." She said that she'd grown up very poor. For Christmas when she was a little girl, her parents once gave her IOUs instead of gifts. There was no way, she said, her kids would ever go without gifts at Christmas. April's post showed that she homeschooled her children. These kids had to spend a lot of time together, and she admitted her eldest girl, Crystal, sometimes wanted to strangle the boys, but they all got along most of the time. The boys were good kids, she said, one time writing on a nail polish thread, "My 18-year-old son hates me when I tell him that he used to want his nails polished. LOL." She was talking about Michael, the eldest of the Beaver children. At that very moment, Michael, along with his younger brother Robert, 16, were quietly building an arsenal: guns, knives, body armor, and stacks of ammunition. Obsessed with serial killers and spree shooters, they had one goal: massacre their entire family and make sure the world would never forget their names. On the night of the massacre, their brother, 12-year-old Daniel, managed to call 911 as screaming and commotion was heard in the background. A male voice said hello, and then the line went dead, but the police were able to trace the call. When the officers arrived at the house, the horror began before they even stepped inside. Blood stained the porch, and from within they heard a faint, agonizing groan. Slowly, they pushed open the front door. Lying on the floor, barely clinging to life, was 13-year-old Crystal. Nearby, Daniel, the boy who had made that desperate 911 call, was dead. 5-year-old Victoria had also been slaughtered, stabbed repeatedly. Christopher, just 7 years old, lay motionless in a pool of blood. The boys were soon found after hiding out in the woods. They admitted to the murders, telling the police they'd filmed the act with recently purchased surveillance equipment. They had planned to show the cops the video and post another online because, well, they wanted to be famous. Both boys will now spend all of their lives in prison and have plenty of time to think about their fame. We're not sure if we'd call these boys evil or something else, but this next man, we have no problem throwing his name into the evil box and dumping it in the trash can of history. Number 3. The Devil and Disney. German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "No one is such a liar as the indignant man." What he meant was that those consumed by anger and resentment often hide behind moral outrage, using it as a disguise. This all relates to a vile crime that was committed in 2024. The perpetrator was a big fan of Reddit, where he often vomited up moral outrage under the username Sustanet. One of the focal points of his outrage was related to the cast members, or CMs, who work at Disney parks, who according to his posts are underpaid, overstressed, and underappreciated. He once said, "You clearly have no idea what these jobs involve, how hard these CMs work every day, or the amount they endure." But he, being the good man he was here to set the record straight. You could virtually see the indignance in each word as it exploded into flames on the page. Of course, Sustanet used to be a cast member himself, once writing to another CM on Reddit, "As a former fellow attraction CM, I salute you, you steely-eyed magic maker." Now, call us cynical, but we doubt Sustanet was trying to make magic for people as much as he liked hanging around places where you are sure to find plenty of girls. He was much more Maleficent than he was Mickey Mouse. He enjoyed giving advice to young people online, even once commenting on the subreddit Advice for Teens. The post has since been deleted, but his words remain. To a young girl struggling with a friendship, he bluntly stated, "She has failed at the most basic requirement for friendship. Don't treat each other like crap." Then offering wisdom to a teen that was navigating the stormy seas of adolescence, he wrote, "Find the people that make you happy, reflect who you are and who you want to be, and treat them well." Someone wrote below, "It's heartbreaking what happened, and he was over here giving advice to teenagers." The evidence is Sustanet on Reddit telling teens about red flags in relationships, when the reddest flag of them all should have been waving atop every single word he wrote. Let us explain. His name was Steven Stearns. Moments after lecturing kids about the dangers of defective parents and the true meaning of friendship, he found himself in a jail cell, staring down the hard end of a very long prison sentence. In March 2024, the body of 13-year-old Madeline Soto was discovered at around 4:30 p.m. off Hickory Tree Road in Central Florida. Madeline was the daughter of the woman Stearns had been dating for a few years. On the day of the disappearance, Stearns had told Maddie's mom that he had time to drop Maddie off at middle school in Orlando. Video evidence shows him throwing something in a dumpster later that day, items that turned out to be Maddie's backpack and her school-issued laptop. She was also seen slumped in the passenger seat of the car he was driving. Later, cops arrested him and uncovered what they described as disturbing photos and videos on his phone, files he had desperately tried to delete. The state said it sought the death penalty, but it seems that Stearns thinks that is cruel and unusual punishment and is looking to strike the charge from his case. Number 2. Writer's Wrath. 2 years ago, a Redditor on the No Sleep OCC subreddit, a fictional horror story sub, wrote, "It feels unreal. This man went to my baby shower. He sent my kids birthday presents. He was going to my formal wedding." The comment below said, "He seemed like a nice enough fellow when I saw him engage with the community." Redditors knew him as N.M. Wrights, a talented horror writer with a knack for crafting chilling crime stories. But in real life, he was Nicholas Kasotis, a 42-year-old former judge advocate general corps officer in the U.S. Navy. Highly educated, he held a Master of Laws in National Security Law from Georgetown University. By all accounts, he was a formidable storyteller. One fan recalled that Nick's most well-known story was about a woman realizing her husband was trying to kill her. A Romana clip, perhaps? A story rooted in reality, just with different names? In another tale, as usual, written in the first person, a commenter said, "Very well done. This is how to get away with murders." To which Nick replied, "It comes at a price most are unwilling to pay." Nick had been doing very well, better than most writers plying their trade on Reddit. In a post 3 years earlier, he'd announced Sony had bought the rights to his story. Nick had scaled the dizzying heights of Reddit horror, thrilling and frightening his audience with tales of murder and mayhem. Then on December 2, 2022, one of his stories came to life. Two hunters were stalking around the woods of the Portal Hunting Club in Riceboro, Georgia, when they made what we cliché-loving writers like to call a grisly discovery. Parts of a dead woman. A subsequent search discovered her body parts were spread over a 3-mile radius. The FBI pieced together the remains, identifying them as belonging to a white female with brown eyes and shoulder-length brown hair. She was estimated to be between 5'9" and 5'10" inches tall, weighing about 185 to 200 pounds, and somewhere between 20 and 50 years old. One distinct detail stood out. She had a single tooth implant in her upper right jaw. With the help of the crime lab, the DNA profile showed that this woman was Mindy Kasotis, Nick's beloved wife, the one seen in the beautiful white wedding dress in 2016 when the two got hitched. There's not much more we can say about Nick's case other than the fact that he has been charged. The latest reports in 2025 confirm his trial date is set. But as for why this Navy judge and Reddit raconteur allegedly murdered and dismembered his wife, well, not much has been revealed. Which is a pity because we all love a good story. Now for a tragic story of a teenager who got lost in a social media maze of hatred. Number 1. Extreme Teen. Imagine the teacher's surprise when a student at a New York high school approached him and casually stated that his life goal after graduation was, quote, to murder someone. This was the same quiet, well-mannered boy who had once dreamed of becoming a civil engineer, just like his mom and dad. But something had snapped, and it seemed his metamorphosis wasn't natural. It was the result of a digitally cast spell. Peyton S. Gendron had gone online and learned all the wrong things about life. He had crawled into a conspiracy theory-laden, people-hating rabbit hole. And when he popped out the other end months later, he was talking about killing innocent people. Other students at the school said before that he seemed normal, although he'd once dressed in a hazmat suit for class, so maybe not entirely normal. But as far as red flags go, he wasn't enough to awaken the sleeping giant of therapy. His classmate, Cassandra, later said, he was always very quiet and never much said anything. Lucy, another girl who knew him, told the press, when I talked to him before, I could just tell he would not look into my eyes. Another student said that she knew him well and he was, quote, a really good kid, so sweet, kind. Oh, and he liked guns. He really liked guns, specifically the Bushmaster XM15 AR-15 style rifle. He liked talking about guns on social media, YouTube, Twitch, Discord, 4chan, and yes, Reddit. This quiet lad was something of a writer, later penning a highly racist 180-page manifesto in which that he said the hatred he was about to let loose in the most brutal manner was to, quote, spread awareness to my fellow whites about the real problems the West is facing. That's right, he had a manifesto before the reasoning part of his brain, the prefrontal cortex, had fully developed. He had a philosophy of life before he'd even lived one, and he wanted to become famous. He'd once written in his online diary, "It's not that I actually dislike other people, it's just that they made me feel so uncomfortable. I've probably spent actual years of my life just being online, and to be honest, I regret it." He started frequenting Reddit, obsessed over guns and armor. One of his favorite haunts was the subreddit Quality Tactical Gear, where he eagerly discussed weapons and equipment. One day, he posted a photo of himself decked out in full tactical gear, rifle aimed directly at the camera. He was ready to make himself famous, ready to destroy the lives of strangers. At around 2:30 p.m. on Saturday, May 14, 2022, he arrived. body clad in tactical armor, head protected by a helmet, and a body camera strapped on, broadcasting everything live on Twitch. He'd walked into the parking lot of a top supermarket in Buffalo and shot 4 people, killing 3. Inside the store, chaos erupted. Screams filled the air as he continued his rampage. When it was over, 10 people were dead, 3 more injured. All 10 of the victims were black. A security guard fought back, firing at him, but the bullets couldn't penetrate his body armor that Payton had researched on Reddit. Throughout the rampage, Payton screamed racial slurs. He twice conducted reconnaissance in the weeks before the massacre to ensure that he'd be killing his demographic of choice. That was black people, although his hatred was also aimed at Jewish people, who he said must be called out and killed. Payton was completely devoid of emotional body language during the trial, where at just 19 years old, he was sentenced to serve 11 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge had some harsh words for Reddit, which he said had played a part in radicalizing Payton, and through those subreddits had helped him achieve his aims. Reddit responded by saying there was no room for hate on the platform, but that didn't stop the lawsuit that later hit itself, Meta, and YouTube. Standing before the court, Payton admitted he had acted out of hate. It was a hate that he had fine-tuned online, shaped by the darkest corners of social media, a place where the good, the bad, and the truly ugly coexist. A sharp buzz from the intercom breaks the stillness, followed by the crackle of static. The loving wife of 29-year-old Jerry Brudos calls down to him in his padlocked garage. She knows better than to step foot in his workshop. He's told her she must never enter without his express permission. Hanging lifelessly from a hook above him is the grotesque centerpiece of Jerry's twisted obsession, a human doll fashioned from his latest victim. He moves methodically, dressing and redressing the body, trying to get it perfect. Jerry's fixation on high-heeled shoes takes center stage, one pair now eerily strapped to the feet of the corpse above. In the corner of the garage, a freezer hums softly, its unassuming exterior hiding a gruesome secret, a woman's foot that he uses to model his vast shoe collection. Upstairs, his wife tells him that dinner is on the table, all the while juggling their young daughter Megan and their newborn son Jason in her hands. In the garage, Jerry, momentarily interrupted, sets down a human breast and calmly glances at the intercom. This is just the beginning of the twisted double life of Jerry Brudos. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're exploring the dark mind of one of the most bizarre serial killers in history, the Shoe Fetish Slayer. January 26, 1968. Jerry Brudos appeared to be the picture of a hard-working family man, but beneath the surface lurked a deranged mind, teetering on the edge of darkness. For years, he had kept his urges in check, avoiding a descent into horrific violence. But then, on that winter day, it was as if he had been delivered a victim on a plate. The temptation was irresistible. 19-year-old encyclopedia saleswoman Linda Swanson had unknowingly wandered into danger. She had stepped into Jerry Brudos' yard while he was working outside. Linda had been searching for another house, but a simple mix-up in addresses would seal her fate. She showed him her card, saying she had an appointment, to which Jerry, surprised, paused for a second and lied, saying he was interested in the encyclopedias she was selling. Jerry lured Linda into the basement of his home. He gestured to a stool, inviting her to sit, and Linda launched into her carefully rehearsed sales pitch. Jerry listened intently, his movements calm, as he began to circle the garage. Without a hint of hesitation, he crept up behind Linda and swung a 2x4 with brutal precision, striking the back of her head. As her body collapsed to the floor, Jerry wasted no time. Dropping to his knees, his hands tightened around her neck until she stopped breathing. He dragged her body under the suitcase, covered it up, and went back inside the house. He later told police he told his mom to go out and buy hamburgers for everyone. This was new for Jerry: murder. A year earlier, he had stalked a woman in Portland, waited for her to fall asleep at home, and then broke in to steal her shoes. She woke up in a fright and he choked her until her body went limp. Although there was sexual misconduct, she survived the attack. Jerry fled into the night, clutching the stolen shoes like trophies. After filling up on burgers, he returned to the staircase to examine the body. When police later asked him what Linda had been wearing that day, he recalled the parts that were important to him, her underwear perfectly describing the color and style. All he could think about was how he'd later dress her in the collection of women's clothes he had stolen over the years. His exact words were that he wanted to dress her like she was a big doll. That was what he did while engaging in his fantasies, photographing her every time he changed her outfit. He didn't hang Linda's body on a hook. He didn't even have a workshop for that first murder, so after hours of dressing and redressing her, at about 2 a.m., he loaded her into his car and drove to a bridge. Pretending to stop for a flat tire and pulling out the jack, he pushed her over a railing into the water, although he'd later say he forgot the exact place. Jerry's favorite part of the human anatomy was the feet, so before he disposed of Linda's body, he took a hacksaw and he sawed off the left one. He planned to freeze it below all the meat in his freezer and use it to model his women's shoe collection. For a first murder, he considered this a successful day. Before we get to the next murder, we should explain something about Jerry and shoes to give you an idea of what kind of man we're dealing with. When he was about 5, he was playing in a garbage dump when he saw a beautiful pair of shoes, just like the ones his very domineering, often abusive mother wore. Getting his hands on a pair, even at such a young age, gave him a thrill. He put them on and it felt incredibly powerful. It made him feel like the boss. But beneath the surface, that feeling awakened something darker, a deep and forbidding arousal that he didn't yet fully understand. It felt so good wearing them that he took them home, hiding them in his bedroom. He'd get home from school excited to put them on and strut around the house pretending he was a bossy mom. He was doing that one day when suddenly he heard a loud shriek behind him. It was his mother, her face contorted with terror and disgust. She was already incredibly strict, and now she went crazy, screaming at him, shaming and humiliating him. She made him burn them, his eyes filling with tears as he watched them melt in the flames. He would really miss those shoes. By the age of 28, Jerry was a happily married man. He may have been a killer, but domestically, not much had changed. He had a good job in Oregon as an electrician with his wife Darcy, who loved him dearly. They had a baby son and a 6-year-old daughter, and everyone got along very well. Jerry was always considerate and kind, a gentle, loving father. But when Darcy gave birth to Jason, something changed in their relationship. It started when, for some reason, she wouldn't allow him to be at her side during the birth. This upset him deeply, and after years of semi-normality, he went out and stalked the woman in Portland, the one he left for dead, and he took her shoes. With baby Jason taking up all of Darcy's energy, she wasn't as interested in the intimacy that she and Jerry had once enjoyed. She started saying that she was tired every time he asked her to dress up in lacy underwear and his favorite high-heeled shoes. When he killed Linda, he had no need for Darcy's dressing up routines. The problem was bodies tend to decompose and bring an unwelcome stench of decay. He wanted something reliable, something multi-use, which is why he took her foot. But it wasn't enough. 11 months passed after the death of Linda, and Jerry was starting to feel sexually frustrated again. Then one night, on his drive home from work, an opportunity presented itself. Alongside Interstate 5 between Salem and Albany stood 23-year-old Jan Susan Whitney, next to her broken-down Rambler, stranded and vulnerable. Jerry and the family had recently moved into a new house, a place just a few blocks from Oregon State Hospital, somewhere Jerry knew very well. The best thing was the house had a garage connected to it, the place he set up as his workshop for his hobby, photography. He put a giant padlock on the door, telling Darcy not to interrupt while he developed photos in his makeshift darkroom. This frustrated her. After all, she often needed access to the freezer. So Jerry, good with all things electric, installed an intercom. Now she could buzz him whenever she needed to grab some meat or let him know dinner was ready. When Jerry saw Jan Whitney on the highway, he pulled over and inspected the damage. He told her he could fix it, but he'd have to go home where he had all of his tools. He'd been in a foul mood lately. Recently, he had an argument with Darcy and she called him fat. He stormed out of the room, returning wearing a bra stuffed with paper, his muscular legs adorned in stockings, a girdle, and high-heeled shoes. "Do I look fat now?" he screamed in earnest. Darcy just laughed. She'd never seen anything so ridiculous. But he looked so serious, so she just forgot about it and never brought it up again. Jerry pulled up outside of the house with Jan in the passenger seat. He told her that they'd have to wait until his wife got home, explaining that he didn't have house keys. As they were waiting, he slipped over into the back seat. "Let's play a game," he said. He bet that she couldn't perform the hand movements of tying a shoelace with her eyes closed. As she tried to do it, he put a strap around her neck and strangled her to death. Now he had doll number 2, which he dragged out of the car and into his workshop. There he engaged in his depraved fantasies, taking photographs as he dressed her in his favorite stolen clothes. He hung the lifeless body from a hook, admiring his work with a twisted pride. Each day after work, he rushed home eager to dress her and feed his twisted perversions. His wife and kids were just yards away in the house. Jerry was already the proud owner of a foot, but this time he wanted to have something that would never decompose, a lifetime souvenir. He removed one of Jan's breasts and he made a mold, hoping to turn it into a paperweight. Jerry was always good with his hands, but he wasn't content with the result, so he filled it with sawdust and pinned it to a board. Despite what he perceived as a hobbyist's failure, he kept the paperweight. This would become one of his many blunders as a serial killer. But the first time he almost got caught was just plain bad luck. It was Thanksgiving and he'd promised to take the family on a weekend trip. While they were away, a car crashed right outside of his house, smashing into his garage where Jan was still decomposing on the hook. When police turned up, one of the officers shone his flashlight into the garage to see how much damage had been done. But thanks to all the dust and debris, he failed to notice a body hanging from a hook. Later, Jerry took Jan down, covered her in plastic sheets, and hid her in another building so the cops could detail the damage for their report. Once the coast was clear, Jerry loaded her body into his car. Like Linda before her, Jan's final destination was a river. Jerry weighed her down to ensure she would sink, but Jerry was starting to make mistakes. 2 young women were now missing, but the cases weren't linked, and despite some things in Jerry's past we'll talk about soon, there was no reason he would be a suspect in an investigation. Both times he had met these women by accident and had no connection to them whatsoever. But then, Darcy became suspicious. Shortly after Jerry's 30th birthday party, Darcy broke the golden rule. She entered the garage without his permission. The door had been left open, and curiosity got the better of her. Inside, she wandered through the space her husband guarded so fiercely. Her eyes landed on a series of photographs hanging out to dry. At first glance, they seemed innocent enough, but as she looked closer, she realized they were women. What she failed to notice, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that some of Jerry's models were dead. When Jerry got home, peeved but not angry, Darcy had been in his workshop. He told her the photos were just some work he was helping a college kid with. He'd been acting very strange lately. They never talked about the time he dressed up and screamed at her, but she could barely ignore it when sometime later she found a stack of photos. This time the model was Jerry, dressed up in lacy lingerie, not a particularly attractive sight with his potbelly. She might not have confronted him about it, but when she found the paperweight that looked exactly like a woman's breast, she just had to say something. He told her he'd made it himself, but just for fun, like a naughty novelty item. To prove to her how innocent it was, he put it on the living room mantelpiece. Yet another mistake he made. Jerry wasn't what you would call the genius type of killer, but like the majority of them, once he had a taste for murder, he became addicted to it. His crimes escalated, and that is when he got sloppy. By March, Jerry's dark urges had resurfaced, and he decided it was time for another doll. He'd bought a gun for convenience sake and prowled the streets hunting for his next victim. As he drove his car into a parking lot, he spotted a stunning girl in a short skirt and striking high-heeled shoes, perfect for his twisted fantasies. But by the time he parked and searched for her, she was gone. And that's when he saw 18-year-old Oregon State University chemistry student Karen Elena Sprinkler walking toward a department store to meet her mom. Karen wasn't quite as impressive as the other girl, but she would do, despite Jerry not liking her shoes. He followed her to the department store, and just as she was passing through an indoor car park, he walked up behind her and held a gun to her back. While her mom waited for her in the mall, Jerry drove her back to his place. He said he wouldn't kill her, she just had to model various clothes and shoes for him as he engaged his depravities and took pictures of her. No doubt petrified, traumatized, she did as asked. Karen kicked out in panic, but soon she was dead. Jerry dressed her dead body in various outfits, severed her chest, adding paper to a bra to make it look right, and to prevent her bleeding over the interior of his car. He took many photographs that day, one of them featuring a mirror on the floor, below her and his own drooling face in the reflection. This macabre image would one day be seen by detectives, but as Karen dangled from that ceiling, the cops were nowhere near catching him. To anyone looking, Jerry Brudos was a happily married working man with a lovely wife and 2 beautiful, well-cared-for children. As for witnesses, 2 young women told the police the day Karen went missing that they'd seen a large man dressed in drag out on the parking garage roof. At the time, Jerry's secret life wasn't known to many people, but as you'll soon see, he did have a strange past. The thrill he derived from murder was now taking up every second of his life. It was just a month or so after Karen's death, he tried to abduct 24-year-old Sharon Wood after she'd parked up in a garage in Portland. She felt a tap on her shoulder, and when she looked around, a gun was pointing at her face, but Sharon was a fighter. As Jerry tried to manhandle her, she punched and kicked back, crunching her teeth into his thumb as he yelped in pain. He managed to knock her unconscious, but a car passed by, causing him to run away. But now a survivor had seen his face. However, police didn't connect Karen's disappearance with what happened to Sharon. In the same month, he tried to abduct a 14-year-old schoolgirl named Leanne Brumley. Again, he used his gun, threatening to shoot her if she didn't do as he said, and got in his car, a green Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. He promised he wouldn't hurt her, but it was a bare-faced lie. She was lucky that a woman saw them from her garden, and when Leanne screamed, Jerry ran. Now he had been seen by several witnesses, and police had a good description of his car. But this was 1969, and there were no computers with which to check cars and men with histories of crimes against women. Had those systems existed, his name might have come up. After his mom had made him burn those shoes he loved so much, he had a one-track mind. In first grade, he was sent home from school for trying to steal his female teacher's shoes. His mother, who'd often made him feel ashamed in front of other females, flew into one of her rages. Her son had already developed a serious fetish, but this was not something she understood. She also hated anything to do with sex, so anything she said about it likely made Jerry worse. A Radford University report years later noted, "Mother favored his brother and showed extreme disgust for anything sexual." Jerry was sick in the head already and ashamed of his sexuality. He secretly started identifying stolen shoes and women's clothing with sex and power. This escalated when he was 16. He'd already stolen some clothes from an 18-year-old girl in his neighborhood, but that wasn't enough. He wanted more, so he set up a plan to lure her into his web. He told her he had stolen her underwear, and if she went to his house, he'd give it back. When she got there, she was accosted by a man in a mask holding a knife. A year or so later, he lured a 17-year-old girl to a deserted farmhouse. There, he beat her, breaking her nose. A couple stopped at the scene of the crime. He claimed that he wasn't the attacker, but he had tried to help her. The couple didn't believe him, and eventually the Oregon State Police obtained his confession. After searching his house and car, they found a collection of women's undergarments and Polaroid photos of teenage girls. He was arrested for assault and battery, and it was soon decided he wasn't right in the head. For the next 9 months, he went to school during the day, and at night his home was Oregon State Hospital. Psychiatrists said his problem was an adjustment reaction of adolescence with sexual deviation and fetishism. They said he had a schizotypal personality disorder, and his problems, his strange fantasies, were a consequence of hatred for women, especially his mom. He managed to graduate from high school with less than average grades. He briefly attended technical college but soon dropped out and enlisted in the Army, obtaining the rank of E2. The other soldiers said he lived in a fantasy world, making up stories about sneaking off in the night to the bed of a hot Korean girl. Taking matters into his own hands, Jerry sought out the chaplain, who referred him to an Army psychiatrist. After a series of evaluations, the psychiatrist's report was damning. It described Jerry as suffering from bizarre obsessions. This diagnosis sealed his fate, and soon after, Jerry the soldier was officially discharged from the Army. It was next-level weird. That much was obvious to the people close to him, but no one thought he'd become a killer. He returned to living with his domineering mom and alcoholic father, who were so disgraced with him, they forced him to live in the shed. It was during his shed days that he attacked a young woman in the street and stole her shoes. He would sleep with them because, as he would later admit, they made him feel powerful. He was on a fast track to prison or the asylum, but at the age of 21, he seemed to grow out of his perversions. He got his FCC license to install communication systems and started working at a radio station in the city of Corvallis, Oregon, which was around the time he met 17-year-old Darcy. Her parents didn't like him at all, but her wild and rebellious ways impressed Jerry, and soon the two were married. They had Megan, moved house a few times, and life seemed pretty good. What snapped in Jerry to turn him into a killer, we may never know. He had a bad electric shock at work one day, something his colleagues said changed him. And then there was Jason, who Darcy gave all of her attention to, maybe making Jerry jealous and in need of sexual gratification, the twisted version he'd honed in his youth. Even though he had a history of strange obsessions and acts of violence against girls, when police were looking for the abductor, Jerry was not in the line of fire. Still, they now had a description, and it did fit Jerry. About 6 feet, 200 pounds, brownish hair, and early 30s. After his failures with Sharon and Gloria, he was desperate for another doll. That same month, he went out in search again. He found 22-year-old Linda Dawn Sally at Portland's Lloyd Center shopping mall. Walking up to her, he flashed what looked like a police badge, telling her he'd just seen her stealing goods from a store. She hadn't, of course, but agreed to get in his car, where he then informed her she was being kidnapped and someone would have to pay the ransom. They then pulled into the driveway, and to Jerry's dismay, Darcy was already home making dinner. He took Linda into the garage, where he tied her hands and feet, and then he went inside to eat with his wife and children. When he was done, he went back to Linda, who had freed herself from the restraints but hadn't managed to escape. Jerry later told the police she asked him, "Why are you doing this to me?" as he wrapped a leather strap around her neck and lifted her into the air. When police later found her body, there were burns on her torso. This time, Jerry had to reanimate his victim, a real-life Dr. Frankenstein routine. While she was hanging there dead, he stuck a hypodermic needle in her, just below her ribs, and ran a powerful electric current into her. He told police he was disappointed with the result. He'd hoped that she would dance for him. Dressing her in high heels and lingerie wasn't enough. He wanted a living doll, but the charges just burned her rather than make her limbs perform for him. When he was done with her body, it was time to dispose of it in the river. The same river that now served as the watery grave for Jerry's growing list of victims. But Jerry had made a rookie mistake with every one of them. He'd weighed the bodies down, using objects that could easily be traced back to his job. He'd used car parts for the weights and electrician's wire to fasten them to the body. He evidently didn't do a good enough job because Linda Sally's body floated to the surface. The autopsy revealed post-mortem sexual activity, but what they couldn't understand was the burn marks close to her ribs and armpits. Underwater search teams soon found the body of Karen. It was lying on the riverbed, weighed down with car parts, only about 20 yards from where Linda's body had emerged. The head-scratching moment came when they inspected the body and found that she was wearing, at the time of her death, a 38D bra. This was many sizes too big for her and had paper towels stuffed into where the breasts were missing. Besides knowing there was a maniac on the loose, they also knew they were probably dealing with a mechanic or an electrician, certainly someone good with their hands. They checked out the car parts he'd used and spoke to the girls' families and friends. Did the girls know any mechanics or electricians? It seemed not, but during the investigation, a man started making calls to dorms at Oregon State University where Karen had studied. He told the girls he was a Vietnam vet and wanted a blind date. Most of them thought he was a creep, but one girl decided she would give it a go. When detectives later asked her how the date had been, she said it ended a little strangely. The man had started talking about those girls who had been pulled out of the river and then looked at her in the eye and said, "How do you know I wouldn't take you to the river and strangle you?" She said he was white, in his 30s, tall, kinda heavy, with thinning blondish red hair and freckles, and he had driven a dirty station wagon. She saw kids' clothes in the back seat, so she figured he was married. When this girl agreed to go out on another date, police swooped in and arrested him. Finding out his name was Jerry Brudos, an electrician. His record showed he had once been in trouble for sexual crimes, and the two houses he lived in recently were close to where girls had gone missing or there had been attempted abductions. Jerry didn't drive a Volkswagen Carmen Ghia, but his mother did. The 14-year-old girl he tried to put in it that day saw him in a lineup and identified him immediately. They now had probable cause, enough to get a warrant and search his house. They found stacks and stacks of women's shoes, as well as all the clothes and underwear he'd used to dress as human dolls. They also found his photograph collection, a large stack of images that included pictures of dressed-up women, some alive, some obviously dead. One was just him, his legs covered in nylon stockings and a pair of women's shoes on his feet. And that's when they saw the photo with the mirror on the floor showing his reflection. Then there was the photo that was clearly Karen, still alive, dressed in high heels, looking like someone absolutely petrified. The craziest thing was that Jerry's wife seemed to have no idea about her husband's secret life. She and the kids obviously loved and trusted him, but when the detectives picked up what looked like a human breast paperweight from the mantel, something probably clicked in Darcy's mind. At one point, Jerry called her from jail, pleading with her to destroy key pieces of evidence. She didn't follow through, but suspicion surrounded her nonetheless. During the investigation, police intercepted her driving the station wagon, and in the backseat was Jerry, hiding under a stack of clothes. Later, a neighbor would accuse her of once helping Jerry move a body. It did seem strange that he'd been a serial killer and extreme criminal fetishist right under her nose, and she'd known nothing about it. Soon his face was in the newspapers. Jerry Brudos, the fetish freak. This time they weren't exaggerating, the stories barely even touched the surface. It took some time, but eventually he gave out all the details, including his evolution from a 5-year-old foot freak to a Frankenstein doll maker. The understatement of the year in 1969 was when he told them, "There must be something wrong with me." Darcy was also arrested, but eventually found not guilty of being an accessory. She took the kids and vanished into obscurity after changing her name and breaking off contact with Jerry. But he never stopped saying he loved her all the time he was in prison. He was, by all accounts, a model patient at Oregon State, where he helped with the computer systems and installed cable TV. The officers called him polite, but he was a sex offender, and at other times prisoners ensured he got sex offender karma. He was found dead in his bed in 2006, after which Jan Whitney's sister said good riddance to a trust monster. Jan was found in the river about a month after his arrest, but the first victim, Encyclopedia Linda, was never found. November 1934, Missing Persons Bureau, New York City. The detective's hands trembled as he gripped the letter, his face etched with disbelief. It had been years since the grieving mother last saw her daughter. That day, the little girl vanished, skipping innocently toward what she thought was a birthday party, her tiny hand in the grasp of an elderly man. But this letter could change everything. Its contents were a nightmare, and what had happened to her body. Murder, mutilation, cannibalism. Across the desk, the mother listened, her world shattering with each word. The man who had taken her child wasn't just a killer, he was a monster, a real-life boogeyman. Yet this horrifying revelation was just the beginning. What unfolded next was a story so chilling, it would go down in history as one of America's darkest chapters. Who was he, and how did they catch him? That's what you'll find out on today's episode of the Infographics Show, America's most evil serial killer, the Gray Man. It was a time of despair for the citizens of New York. The Great Depression had drained the city of its energy, leaving half of its factories shuttered and countless families trapped in poverty. Desperation clung in the air like an acrid smoke billowing from the few remaining factory chimneys. But now, the residents had to contend with a new fear, a boogeyman that stalked the streets, a gray-haired old man with a long mustache. Witnesses had seen him, including Grace's own mother, and his unassuming appearance made him all the more sinister. And the man she described sounded a lot like the old guy who had taken another boy, Billy Gaffney. On February 11, 1927, 4-year-old Billy was playing in the hallway outside of his apartment with his friend Billy Beaton. Inside of the apartment, Beaton's 12-year-old brother kept a watchful ear on them, but then the hallway fell silent. When the brother stepped outside to check, the boys were gone. Panic gripped him, and soon a frantic search party combed the building. They eventually found Billy Beaton trembling and disoriented on the roof, but Billy Gaffney had vanished without a trace. When he was asked where his friend had gone, Beaton said the boogeyman took him. Police would never find Billy's body, but one day they would hear what the killer did to him, and it was a story that defied belief. During the investigation of his abduction, the cops had a number of suspects, including the serial killer Peter Kudzanowski, whose preferred victims were youngsters. But the man Billy Beaton described was old and gray. He was fairly well-dressed, a real gentleman, just like the man who had taken 9-year-old Frances McDonald in 1924. Unlike Gaffney, Francis's body was found. It was located in the woods, hidden under some branches. His clothes had been torn from his body and his suspenders were used to strangle him. He had been beaten badly. He had been mauled. Just before he went missing, Francis's mother had seen an elderly gentleman pass by their house. She was nursing her infant daughter on the porch, and the man tipped his hat to her. She later told detectives, "I saw his thick gray hair and his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray." Later that day, as Francis was with a group of other young boys playing ball in the street, this gaunt gray man would approach them. The witnesses told detectives they watched as the man and one of the boys headed off into a wooded area. Francis's father, a policeman, organized a search party, and it wasn't until long that they found the little boy. Little did they know someone had already disturbed the killer, forcing him to abandon his twisted assault. Word soon spread throughout those poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Parents warned their children to watch out for the person they were now calling the Gray Man. Manhattan fingerprint experts were brought in to work on the case. 250 plainclothes cops joined a huge manhunt, but the Gray Man remained a shadow. That was until one day he came knocking at the door of Grace Budd's family home. On May 25, 1928, Grace's brother Edward had placed a classified ad in Sunday's edition of the New York World newspaper. Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. He was a strong, hard-working man who was dedicated to his family. He wanted to earn enough money to get everyone out of their dirty apartment in one of the city's most overcrowded neighborhoods. On Monday, Edward's mom, Dalia, opened the door to a respectable-looking elderly gentleman. The man said his name was Frank Howard. He was a farmer out in Farmingdale, Long Island, and it just so happened he needed help. Delia told her daughter, Beatrice, to go fetch Edward from his friend's nearby apartment. The old man smiled at the girl and threw her a shiny nickel. She thought he spoke well and he had a kind face. He looked much older than his days, probably because his hair was all gray, including his droopy mustache. He told her he lived in the city for many years working as an interior decorator, but he'd had enough of the crowds and the factory smoke, so he left for Long Island, where he used his savings to buy a farm and move his 6 kids and his wife out there. Unfortunately, his wife hadn't taken the farming life and took off about a decade ago. He was left to bring up his 6 kids and run the farm all by himself. But the old man wasn't exactly telling her the whole truth. Born Hamilton Howard Fish in 1870 to an English-American father and a Scots-Irish-American mother, he was the youngest of 4 children. Tragedy struck early in his life. At just 5 years old, his father died of a heart attack, leaving his mother unable to care for him. Desperate and overwhelmed, she placed him in an orphanage. It was at this point he decided to reinvent himself, changing his name to Albert, taking it from a deceased sibling. At the orphanage, Albert was subjected to regular beatings. Strangely, while other children recoiled from the pain, Albert seemed to find a dark comfort in it. It was as if he enjoyed them. As he went from child to young adult, his interests included going to the public baths and watching men undress. His other unusual compulsion was writing obscene letters to women whose names he just found in the personal ads of newspapers. Albert found solace in anything taboo, which served him well when he became a male prostitute in New York City around the age of 19 or 20. It was on the streets of New York where he was arrested and convicted of forgery and later larceny, spending time behind bars in the notorious Sing Sing prison. But it was also on these streets that his predatory instincts began to take shape. Albert prowled for vulnerable children, not to kill, at least not yet, but to satisfy his dark, twisted desires. Even then, he was already a monster, yet the depravity that would later define him was still growing. At age 28, his mom found a wife for him, a woman 9 years older. They had 6 kids together, only for the wife to leave him and the children. She took everything, including the mattress they all slept on. This seems to have pushed Albert, who is now 37, over the edge. When he knocked on Bud's door that day, he was 58 and had been a fully formed maniac for many years. Mr. Frank Howard wasn't the honest farmer he claimed to be. There was no sprawling farm in Long Island, no honest work waiting for Delia's teenage son. It was true that he had children and a wife who had left him. Almost everything else he said was a carefully constructed lie. His real plan was far more sinister. He didn't want to hire Delia's strapping son for farm work. He wanted to lure him to a secluded place, mutilate him, and watch him bleed out, and then consume him. He told Delia his non-existent farm was a great success. He had 5 farmhands plus his children who all helped out with the labor. He had a Swedish chef who cooked up tasty meals for the workers, using meat from the dairy cows and hundreds of chickens on the farm. But now one of his farmhands was leaving, and that's what had brought him to Delia's door, looking for her son. An out-of-breath Edward soon arrived at the house after running from his friend's place. Sure, he wanted the job. When could he start? Mr. Howard said immediately, and he paid $15 a week. A very reasonable wage for the time, and if Edward's friend wanted the job, well, why not? He could always use another farmhand. Business was so good these days, which was more than could be said for many New Yorkers still recovering from the economic crash. Mr. Howard said he'd return to the Budd house on Saturday to pick up Edward and take him by train to the farm. It was so refreshing in these dark days to find such a kind and friendly gentleman. With this well-paid job for her son, her family would surely be okay. When Saturday came, the Budds were disappointed when Mr. Howard didn't show up. They did, however, receive a handwritten note explaining a delay and that he'd be there tomorrow. This note would one day become an important piece of evidence. On Sunday, just as promised, Mr. Howard returned. At about 11 a.m., Delia opened the door to find him standing outside, smiling. His arms were full of cartons of strawberries and pot cheese fresh from the farm, or so he said. Suddenly, a little girl appeared hiding behind her mother's skirt, flashing a shy smile at the gray-haired stranger. Delia introduced her as her 10-year-old daughter, Grace. As kids tend to be at that age, she was full of giddy curiosity. It was at this very moment his plan changed. Mr. Howard explained that he had planned to take Edward back to the farm that day, but he had to have a delay He was throwing a birthday party for his niece, who was actually about the same age as Grace. He also spoke to Mr. Budd, who seemed impressed by this very friendly visitor in front of him. He was a simple man who'd left the city and done good for himself, with 20 acres of profitable farmland. Still, he did wonder why, with all that money, Mr. Howard wore quite a tattered-looking suit. As they ate their lunch, Mr. Howard couldn't take his eyes off of Grace. She hummed songs and ran around excitedly. He commented that one day she'd grow up to be a real heartbreaker, and that was about the time he introduced his new plan. He said maybe Grace could go back with him to the farm and join the party. There'd be games and cake and lots of other children. They needn't worry, he'd bring her back later. He had kids and grandkids of his own, so he knew how to take care of children. After the party, he would come straight back for Edward and the job could commence. The Budds, who didn't want to let this future employer of their son down, agreed. They did at least ask where his sister lived, the mother of the birthday child. He told them 137th Street and Columbus Avenue. Had they known the city better, they would have realized Columbus ends at 110th Street. Grace was excited about the party. She'd been to church earlier and was wearing her pretty white silk confirmation dress, a pair of white silk stockings and some faux pearls that made her look much older. Mr. Howard then took a huge wad of bills from his pocket, asking Grace to count them. The Budds had never seen so much money as they proudly watched their clever daughter dutifully count the stack in front of her. After Grace had finished counting, Mr. Howard handed over 50 cents for some candy for her and her sister Beatrice. He gave Edward and his friend Willie $1 each and told them go see a movie and he'd return later in the evening to pick them up. Delia had taken a liking to this kind old man, but she was concerned about handing her daughter over to him. Her husband didn't share her concern, so Mrs. Budd got Grace's coat and her best hat, the one with the ribbon streamers, and sent her on her way. Mrs. Budd watched Grace's ribbons dance in the wind, her hand clasped in the fingers of the man who would later be nicknamed the Werewolf of Wisteria. At the train station, Grace didn't notice the subtle, sinister detail that would seal her fate. Mr. Howard purchased 2 tickets, a one-way ticket for her and a return ticket for himself. That night, the Budd family waited and waited. No one slept a wink, and in the morning they went to the police station to report their daughter missing. After conducting some preliminary investigations, Police Lieutenant Samuel Dribbin delivered the devastating news that made their stomachs sink. The address Mr. Howard had provided didn't exist. Neither did the sister he'd spoken so warmly about. Worse yet, there were no farms in Farmingdale, Long Island tied to anyone by that name. The Budds spent the next few weeks going into the police station and looking at the rogues gallery lineups, men known to have done awful things to children. Police put 20 detectives on the case and mailed about 1,000 flyers to people's houses. They searched high and low for an old gray man and found nothing. They didn't know it, but the gray man had strategies to avoid being seen. The best evidence they had was the message he had written to the Budds, which had been sent from the Western Union office in Manhattan. The man who had sent it, they said, was probably educated just because the spelling and grammar were correct. The truth was, Fish was not very educated. He had had other things on his mind when he could have been studying in his younger years. He'd spent much of his young life being obsessed with human anatomy. As usual with serial killers, grim fascination led to escalation. When he was about 30, he had a sadomasochistic relationship with an intellectually disabled 19-year-old named Thomas Bedden. Whether Bedden agreed to the sadomasochism remains a mystery, but he certainly experienced extreme pain. Fish took him to an old farmhouse where he tied him up and tortured him, an odyssey of suffering lasting many days that ended with castration. Fish would later recount to stunned detectives that he would never forget Bedden's screams. He had been kind enough to pour bleach on the wound and wrap it before he left, slipping a $10 bill in Bedden's pocket and kissing him on the cheek. This was just the beginning of Fish's escalation. As the years passed, detectives knew enough to link the Gray Man cases, but as time went on, the searches ended. Only one man, Detective William F. King, didn't give up looking for this mysterious child abductor. King knew if he kept the story alive, he had a better chance of solving it. In November 1934, he gave false information to the reporter Walter Winchell. The next day, Winchell's story appeared in the newspaper. I checked on the Grace Budd mystery. She was 8 when she was kidnapped about 6 years ago, and it's safe to tell you that the Department of Missing Persons will break the case, or they expect to, in 4 weeks. None of that was true, and Grace was 10 years old, but no doubt the story would have caught the eye of the killer who police knew read the newspapers. And it did catch his eye. 10 days later, the letter arrived at the Budd family house. Delia and her husband, like so many poor Americans of their generation, couldn't read, so Edward read it for them. In it, the killer made chilling references to the gifts he brought to their house that day, the strawberries and pot cheese. He recounted that when he and their daughter got back to his place, he let Grace pick flowers, after which he unrobed and hid in the wardrobe. When he called out to Grace, she ran back inside, unaware of the horror awaiting her. He leapt from the wardrobe, detailing how Grace fought back fiercely, kicking, biting, and scratching, but her strength wasn't enough. He overpowered her, strangled her to death, and in a final grotesque revelation, he claimed to have cut up her flesh, cooked it, and consumed it. Detective King recognized the handwriting as the same as the Western Union note the Buds had gotten all those years ago. He didn't think that this was one of the many hoaxes police had received over the years. Still, some of the letters seemed outlandish, including the part where the writer had expressed how he had acquired a taste for human meat. The killer said in 1894 his friend had traveled on a steamer under Captain John Davis from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. According to the letter, famine was widespread in the country and his friend supposedly developed an appreciation for cannibalism, particularly the flesh of children who he claimed were sold for food. Upon returning to the United States, the friend supposedly continued this gruesome practice, abducting children from the streets to kill and eat. The friend allegedly claimed that human flesh was like no other. The killer had to try it. And that's how the Gray Man, now with a refined palate, met the Bud family. As Detective King had hoped, the killer, who obviously wanted the family to suffer while he played games with the police, had made a significant mistake. He noted a small hexagonal emblem on the envelope, under which were the letters NYPCBA. King ascertained that this stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. He then met with the association and looked for handwriting of members that might match the handwriting in the letter. He met with each member and asked them if they had used the association stationery. No one had. What had seemed like a promising clue turned out to be nothing more than a frustrating dead end. But just as King was about to walk out the door, the janitor approached him. The janitor revealed that just a few weeks ago he had stolen a few sheets of paper and some envelopes from the club. He said he'd likely left a few of them at his old rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street. When King visited soon after, the landlady stood back in shock when he described a gray-haired man with a long mustache. A man just like that stayed here for about 2 months, and he had checked out a couple of days ago. His name, she said, was Albert H. Fish. She explained that during his stay, his son had often sent money. Before he checked out, he told her another letter would arrive and he planned to collect it in person. On December 13, 1934, the landlady made a call to Detective King. Albert Fish was there right now. He returned looking for his letter. He was sitting down drinking a cup of tea when King arrived. When the detective asked his name, a suspicious Fish stood up and said, "Yes?" But before King could move an inch forward, Fish pulled out a razor. King quite easily grabbed Fish's arm, twisted it, and the blade fell to the floor. He might have gotten his man, but he didn't know just what kind of monster he had in his hands. Fish's confession would be one of the biggest events in law enforcement history. It would confound psychiatrists and disgust the public, even though the public got a very censored version through the media. On Wednesday, March the 13th, in the New York Times, right next to the headline, "2 policemen arrested for stealing candy," was another headline, "Fish is identified by girl's parents." Fish admitted to the Grace Budd murder. He told the cops that on that day, he dropped off his butcher knives at a newsstand and picked up Grace at her house. He returned for the knives before heading to the train station. He said when they got off the train, Grace told him he'd left his package behind. Fish ran back and picked it up, giving Grace a heartfelt thank you. He took her to an abandoned house he called Wisteria House on Mountain Road in Irvington, where he had killed her and chopped her body into pieces. Over the next 9 days, he would eat those pieces. When asked why he would do such a depraved act, Fish could offer no explanation. Still, in many interviews he had with cops and psychiatrists, he said after the murder of Grace he felt a deep sorrow. A police captain then asked why the letters? Why put the family through so much pain? To which Fish said he just liked writing. He was clearly insane, but was he legally insane? After his wife had left him with their 6 kids, clearing out all of their belongings, it seems Fish lost his mind. He started hallucinating, explaining that John the Apostle gave him instructions to kill. In the many interviews, he would ramble on and on about the Bible, often citing passages in full. He said surely God and his angels would have stopped him if he had been in the wrong. It was about this time in his life when his fascination with pain went into overdrive. He began embedding long needles into his thighs and abdomen, making his every move excruciatingly painful. It sounded absurd, but when they x-rayed him, they found over 29 needles embedded in his flesh. He also admitted to sticking needles in his young victims. He would beat himself with a paddle studded with nails. He even had his own children beat him. He'd play a game with them, and if he lost, which he always did, they were allowed to beat him with a paint stick or a hairbrush. It seems, though, he never hurt them. Still, they didn't visit him at the jail. He not only admitted to killing Grace and eating her, but he eventually said he'd killed those other two kids, Billy and Francis. The question for detectives was what else had Fish done over those decades of depravity where he was sticking needles into himself? The answer was abducting young people from streets all over the U.S., usually poor kids, often African-American kids or kids with learning difficulties, targeting those that society often overlooked. In his own chilling words, he admitted that those children were less likely to be missed, less likely to raise an alarm once they disappeared. Over those many blood-strewn years, he used his trusted torture and killing kit, a meat cleaver, a hacksaw, and a butcher's knife. He called these his instruments of hell. How often he used them is not certain. He might have murdered 7 or as many as 25 kids, and he hurt hundreds, maybe as many as 400. It was now up to the psychiatrists on the defense team to persuade a jury just how totally insane Albert Fish was. In an interview, he told the defense's chief expert witness, Dr. Frederick Werdum, that he would lure the kids away with candy. He made sure never to return to the same neighborhood, which doesn't sound like the mind of someone clinically insane. He planned ahead, and he had strategies. Still, Dr. Werdum said Fish was extremely infantilistic. He suffered from paranoid psychosis. When asked about his final diagnosis, he said, "He is insane." He wasn't surprised at all to hear that many of Fish's relatives, including some members of his close family, had serious mental health problems, including psychosis, mania, and schizophrenia. 2 other psychiatrists for the defense also said he was completely insane, but the 4 for the prosecution were not in agreement. Many tears were shed on the witness stand. Mr. Budd broke down and could barely finish his testimony, racked with guilt as he was for convincing his wife to let Grace go that day. Fish didn't look moved at all, only saying to his lawyer he preferred to live because God still has work for him to do. His stepdaughter took the stand and said Fish was a good father. Still, she talked about all those violent games he liked to play with his kids and the fact that he would often show them a magic trick. He could insert needles under his fingernails and he would barely even flinch. After 10 days, it took the jury just an hour to reach their verdict of guilty. They knew he was insane, but felt he'd done enough to deserve to be executed. Witnesses said that day Fish looked upset by the verdict, but seemed very much at ease when he told he would be getting the electric chair. On January 16, 1936, he received his final blast of pain. Strapped to the chair in Sing Sing's execution chamber, his last words were, "I don't even know why I'm here." Despite rumors to the contrary, the execution was quick and maybe not as painful as Fish might have hoped. January 13, 1978. Sacramento police officer Frank Davidson's hands trembled slightly as his gaze locked on the unthinkable. His breath was shallow, each exhale laced with shock. Beside him, Detective Wayne E. Ray turned away in disbelief. The small suburban house looked ordinary from the outside until they had crossed the threshold. Teresa Terry Wallen, just 22 years old, was found by her husband David around 6 p.m. A trail of dark, ominous stains guided him into the bedroom where he made the horrifying discovery. Terry lay on the floor, her body riddled with bullet wounds, her chest savagely torn open, and her organs disturbingly scattered across the room. Nearby, a yogurt pot stained with her blood sat on the floor, used, it seemed, as a twisted chalice. But the nightmare didn't end there. Terry wasn't the only victim. She had been pregnant. Her unborn baby was also taken. Davidson and Ray, veterans of tragedy, had never seen anything so monstrous. Who could be capable of such a crime? Find out on today's episode of The Infographics Show, America's most evil serial killer, the Vampire of Sacramento. Thankfully, David Wallen had been spared the full extent of his wife's horrific injuries. The moment he caught a glimpse of her body, he ran out of the house, screaming in terror. He called his parents for help. When they arrived, their shock was palpable. Nearly fainting at the grisly scene in the bedroom, they quickly contacted the police, reporting a murder and describing the chilling sight, stating the body had been opened. There was blood all over the bathroom, too. It would later be discovered the killer went in there to smear the blood on his face, licking his fingers as he looked into the mirror. Neither David, his parents, nor the police initially grasped the full extent of what Teresa had endured before her death. The horrifying truth emerged during the autopsy. Teresa had still been alive when the killer began mutilating her. Mercifully, she had almost certainly been unconscious at the time. Davidson and Ire, seasoned but shaken, knew that they needed outside expertise to catch the monster responsible. That same night, they reached out to the FBI, connecting with a division that handled the most heinous crimes, those often committed by killers, typically men whose acts were almost always driven by a dark sexual motive. This FBI department was in high demand during the 1970s, a decade that kickstarted the golden age of serial murder. One of the agents who went over to Sacramento was Robert Ressler, the man responsible for giving the English-speaking world the term serial killer. After joining the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, or BSU, at Quantico, Virginia, Robert Ressler emerged as perhaps the world's foremost expert on serial killers. Over his distinguished career, he worked on some of the most infamous cases in history, including those of Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy. Ressler's expertise extended internationally. He was the man British detectives turned to during their hunt for Peter Sutcliffe, better known as the Yorkshire Ripper. Ressler had witnessed more than his share of grisly murder scenes over his career. He had sat face to face with some of America's most twisted killers, often sexual psychopaths, who committed unspeakable acts against their victims. Through these encounters, he pioneered what was then a groundbreaking approach: psychological profiling. Though profiling wasn't always foolproof, when it succeeded, it was nothing short of remarkable. One notable example came from Ressler's colleague at the BSU, John E. Douglas. Over a pint in a Yorkshire pub, Douglas advised British detectives searching for the Yorkshire Ripper to focus on an almost invisible loner. The Ripper was likely in his late 20s or early 30s, drove a truck or a cab, and had dropped out of high school. His profile proved astonishingly accurate. Ressler scoured Terry Wallen's house, and he knew instantly this was the work of someone whose mind didn't function like a sane human being. The killer hadn't just murdered Terry, he'd mounted her dead body as he stabbed her furiously in the chest. He even murdered a dog. It was found disemboweled by a neighbor with a gunshot wound in its head. Ressler noted that there had been signs of a struggle in the bedroom. Terry had been taking out the garbage. She picked it up and was about to go out the front door when she was shot by a .22 in the hand. A second bullet broke her jaw. She was shot again in the head, rendering her unconscious but not dead. The killer then dragged her into the bedroom, and that's when he cut her open with what was probably a large butcher's knife. In his notes, Ressler wrote that the man was a white male, 25 to 27 years old. He was very likely a scruffy man, unkempt and skinny, someone who didn't take care of his health. He was not an organized killer. Ressler wrote that there would be evidence of his crimes at his house. He almost certainly had a history of mental illness and was a loner. The killer had issues with women and lived by himself, possibly on welfare. He was likely a high school dropout, Ressler wrote, and no doubt somewhere someone had treated him for paranoid psychosis. Criminal profiling back then was still something of a new technique, not exactly appreciated by old-school police who were skeptical and dismissive of what they considered unscientific. But Ressler's technique was every bit rational. The murder had taken place in a white neighborhood, so in all likelihood the killer was white and lived nearby. People who commit such sexually motivated attacks statistically usually do so to their own race. The mutilation was rushed and animalistic. This, he said, pointed to the mental illness. Disorganized killers often suffer from severe delusions, unlike organized killers who often painstakingly plan their crimes with total clarity of mind. So such an attack was likely the work of someone suffering from schizophrenia with psychotic hallucinations, which is why Ressler thought the attacker was young. If the man had schizophrenia, this often becomes full-blown in a person's early or mid-20s. He'd be thin and unkempt because that's how untreated schizophrenics often look, too ill to eat or to care about their appearance. That's why he likely couldn't hold down a job. He wasn't stable enough to travel far, which is why Ressler believed he was local. The crime was escalation, Ressler said. The killer had built up to it, possibly after following people around or attacking them. He'd definitely been violent in the past. There was no other recent mutilation murders on record in the area, so Ressler figured it wasn't the killer's first murder. He was right about everything, except one detail, quite a major one. Richard Chase was a sweet child, a lovely-looking kid with freckles on his cheeks. You could call him the quintessential all-American kid, the kind of boy straight out of a movie. With perfect white teeth, a charming smile, and a middle-class suburban family. Their home would be wrapped in a white picket fence, framing a manicured garden. Except these perfect American families in Hollywood movies weren't always representative of reality. Chase's mother, Beatrice, a teacher, was far from perfect. She often acted mentally unhinged and accused her husband, Richard Sr., a computer scientist, of poisoning her food, taking drugs, and cheating on her. He denied it all, telling her she suffered from paranoia. When Richard got home from baseball practice or Cub Scouts, he was often beaten by his argumentative parents, who at the best at times ignored him and his sister Pamela. It was during these dark days of early childhood when he started to take an interest in animals. Often it was cats from the neighborhood, which he tortured and killed, fascinated about what was inside of them. At around the age of 15, he began taking LSD. This good-looking young man soon stopped taking care of his appearance. He was known as an acid head, with strange tendencies, so he didn't make many close friends. Richard began killing dogs, birds, and rabbits, a strangeness his mom mostly ignored. Her son had always been a little bit different, but it wasn't a problem, she often said. He'd wet the bed until he was 8. He liked to light fires, qualifying him for what's known as the triad of sociopathy: hurting animals, lighting fires, and bedwetting. He graduated high school in June of 1968, and his parents bought him a Volkswagen, hoping this might speed up his transition to being a responsible adult. He found jobs only to lose them. He made friends, but his behavior was too strange to maintain those relationships. Beneath it all, he was battling paranoid schizophrenia, something his parents ignored for as long as they could. At age 23, he was described by a doctor as tense, nervous, and wild-eyed, a filthy, disheveled, deteriorated, and foul-smelling white male. He'd earlier walked into the ER saying he was dying, complaining that his blood had stopped flowing through his body and a pulmonary vein was missing. His behavior worsened. Sometimes he told his mom his heart had stopped beating and someone had taken out his arteries. Naturally, he needed a blood transfusion. All over his bedroom walls were pictures of human organs that he cut out of medical books. He was obsessed with the inside of bodies. The hospital diagnosed him with acute paranoid schizophrenia, or at the very least, this was a drug-induced psychosis. The doctor noted that the young man's schizophrenic mother came into the ward acting aggressively, demanding her son be released. She knew about his worsening issues, but she couldn't handle it. She'd been accused several times by him of controlling his mind. She knew he was lost, but she thought he'd grow out of it. This was exactly the kind of person Robert Ressler was looking for, someone who had slipped through the cracks. But the truth was, those cracks were very big. In 1976, at the age of 26, less than 2 years before the murders, Chase was put into a psychiatric nursing home after it was discovered he'd been killing rabbits and injecting their blood into his veins. He'd take their intestines and other organs and blend them into a fine paste he could drink. On one visit to Richard's apartment for their usual game of chess, his father was greeted by rabbits scurrying freely around the place, leaving pellets all over the floor. Richard seemed completely indifferent. When his father cautiously asked about the rabbits, Richard replied without a hint of irony that they were for eating. His dad decided it was better not to ask any more questions. He probably should have. At one point, Richard was admitted to the hospital for blood poisoning when he told the staff what he said was a bizarre story about eating a rabbit that had acid in its stomach. At this point, he lived at times with his mother and then his father, who had now left the family home. Neither of them really wanted him, and his grandmother, whom he told his heart was hurting, didn't know what to do with him. He finally begged his mother for medical help, saying something was seriously wrong with his mind. A doctor told her Richard was suffering from a psychiatric disturbance of major proportion. At the hospital, they called him Dracula. One day, he captured 2 birds and, to the horror of onlookers, bit off their heads as screams filled the room. He insisted his heart was weak, using this excuse to steal syringes and draw blood from therapy dogs. His presence was so unsettling that 2 nurses resigned, unable to endure another day around him. They called him sick and dangerous, and they said he needed help. But again, the doctors released him back into the population. The drugs, they said, were working. No one, not even his mother, was taking Richard Chase's spiraling mental illness seriously. She didn't like the way the drugs made him seem like a zombie, so she helped him wean off of them. It was around this time he barely left the apartment, occasionally spotted by neighbors taking in dogs and cats that were never seen again. In August 1977, Nevada police spotted something bizarre through their binoculars: a naked man running through the dusty wilderness, his skin smeared in red. They detained him and found the scene in his Ford Ranchero truck equally disturbing. Inside were 2 rifles, a pile of men's clothing, a bucket of blood, and a liver sitting on the seat. The young man admitted the blood and liver were from a cow and that he had deliberately covered himself in it. It was bizarre behavior, but it wasn't a crime. With no laws broken, the police had no choice but to let him go. Chase still occasionally bumped into friends from school. They'd usually stand back in shock at how thin and disheveled he'd become. He always talked about school as if it was yesterday, like he had no recollection of his life after. And he always went on about the same things, ranting about UFOs and aliens. He believed a mysterious crime syndicate was determined to drain his blood on a daily basis. In the October before the murders, he went to the animal shelter and picked up 2 dogs for just $15. The next month, he gladly took some puppies off the hands of a man who was selling them 2 for $1. Neighborhood pets were constantly going missing, but it was never enough. One day, Chase would explain to Ressler why he needed so much blood. Before Ressler knew any of this, he suspected that Terry Wallen had been followed by the killer earlier that day when she'd gone to the shopping mall. She'd walked since it was not far from the house. So this man, whoever he was, would still be skulking around the neighborhood. Ressler said he'd be easy to spot given his unkempt appearance, but if they didn't get to him soon, he would kill again. As usual, Ressler was right. 4 days after the Wallen murder, the killer struck again, about 1 mile from the Wallen place. At 12:30 p.m., the neighbors found 3 bodies: 38-year-old divorced mother Evelyn Myroth, her 6-year-old son Jason, and a family friend, 52-year-old Daniel Meredith. Evelyn had been babysitting a 22-month-old child, her nephew, David. He was missing from the house. Blood was found on his pillow along with a bullet hole. Chase had shot the male victims but otherwise left their bodies undisturbed. Evelyn's fate, however, was far more horrifying, even for seasoned detectives. There were 2 deep cuts across her abdomen from which her intestines had been partly pulled out. The killer had stabbed her in just about every part of her body, including hacking viciously at her face. Detectives entered the bathroom and they were confronted with a deeply unsettling sight. The tub was filled with bloody water. Some theorized the killer might have bathed the infant before taking his life, while others suggested he might have immersed himself in the blood for his own twisted gratification. Whatever the true motive, the act was undeniably depraved. The only thing stolen from the house was Daniel Meredith's wallet. The killer had taken his car when he fled with a baby. The car was soon found very close by, but there was no sign of a baby. Little did the cops know that the parking lot where Chase had dumped this car was only about 100 yards from his apartment complex on Watt Avenue. Ressler was now more certain than ever that they were looking for someone with a serious mental illness. The killer was so insane, he didn't even bother to clean up the crime scenes. Ressler said he probably walked home after ditching the car, covered in blood. His delusion so severe that he would have hardly cared about being seen. It should only be a matter of scouting the neighborhood and they would find this man, Ressler told detectives. But if they didn't get him soon, he'd kill again. He wouldn't ever stop. And now Ressler was sure that the killer was partly committing these crimes to drink the blood of his victims. This was an important part of the process, and the sexual part could have been related to the killer's inability to perform sexual acts without extreme violence. Still, the blood-drinking part didn't make sense. Of course, it was something Ressler could not imagine. Ressler told the local detectives to find out if there had been any cases of anyone in the area drinking blood. Had anyone been caught killing animals? Had anyone seen a man with blood on his clothes? A man who would certainly look like he didn't take care of himself. That Saturday, the police canvassed the neighborhood. A young woman named Nancy recalled a recent trip to the mall where she had seen a sickly-looking man who matched the description police provided. This wasn't a stranger, it was her former schoolmate. She was stunned by his gaunt appearance. Around his mouth was a crusty yellow substance, and his shirt was stained with blood. He barely looked human. She said he approached her asking her about the guy she used to date in school who died in a motorcycle accident. "Were you on the motorcycle when Kurt was killed?" he asked, which she thought was an odd question. His eyes were wide and black, his body filthy. Naturally, Nancy tried to cut the conversation short as she opened her car door and got inside. He grabbed the handle on the passenger side and tried to pull the door open. She slammed her door shut and with shaking hands put the keys into the ignition. As she drove away, he stood there in the street watching her speed off into the distance. Her only thought was, what had happened to him since school? Sure, she told the cop, she knew his name. He was Richard Chase, now 28 years old. In school, he'd been quite popular. He was a decent-looking kid, but as he got older, something changed. Maybe due to all the drugs he took. Chase's house was just a block away from where the police had found that dumped car. When they pulled up outside, he was in the apartment, but he didn't come when they knocked. The apartment owner told him Chase's mother paid the rent and that she'd heard the young man was a casualty of LSD. Police waited for him outside. Sometime later, he appeared walking on the sidewalk with a box in his hands. He saw them and made a run for it, but he didn't get far. When they looked inside the box, they discovered blood-soaked rags. In his back pocket was a wallet containing the ID of Daniel Meredith. He was carrying a gun, a .22. His shoes were covered in blood, as was his orange parka. A quick background check showed his arrest in Nevada, as well as a concealed weapons charge and a number of minor drug charges. As Ressler had said, Chase's house was a pigsty. The living room was a chaotic mess of blood-stained clothes, newspapers, old rags, beer cans, and milk cartons. In the kitchen, the officers almost threw up, not because of the filth, but because they found an unwashed blender, the insides of it stained with blood. One of the detectives opened the fridge door and immediately recoiled in shock. Inside were bloodied plates holding human body parts and a container filled with what appeared to be human brain tissue. What they didn't find, however, was any trace of the missing baby, or even a single clue to its whereabouts. Shuffling through stacks of clothes and magazines, they found animal collars but no animals. They saw newspapers where he'd circled ads for pets being sold. Chillingly, on the dates when he committed the murders, Chase had scrawled the word "today" on his calendar. Even more disturbing, he had marked "today" on 44 other dates that year, likely representing the times he anticipated needing blood and possibly planning to kill again. Back at the station, he was mostly subdued, but when they tried to take some of his blood from his arms, he became hysterical, lashing out at the officers. Of course, they had no idea about his existential fear of losing his blood. Just about everything Ressler had said was correct, except that Mrs. Wallen hadn't been the first victim. In December 1977, Chase had argued with his mom. She told him he couldn't spend Christmas with them. He was too scary for his sister, who was there a few months back, when in a fit of rage he had torn a cat apart with a knife and smeared his face with its blood. In protest of missing this family Christmas, Chase went into the streets and shot a father of two, a 51-year-old engineer named Ambrose Griffin, as he was taking groceries to his car. Chase didn't cooperate at first. He admitted to the animal killings and the drinking blood, but not the 6 murders. More importantly, he wouldn't say what he had done with that baby. His mother, as always, was furious. She said the blood proved nothing. Her son wasn't a killer. Psychiatrists were called in, soon discovering that Richard Chase was suffering from serious psychological illnesses. He was a paranoid schizophrenic who had severe paranoid delusions. He believed his thoughts were like a television that he could watch from a distance. He later explained in detail to Ressler exactly what drove him to do the things he had done. But right now, he wasn't confessing to the murders. It wasn't until March 24th, when a church janitor found a box containing the remains of a male baby, that police could end their hunt. This was the infant they were looking for. Its ragged clothes matched missing items from the house. When police found the body, they discovered keys that had once belonged to Dan Meredith. Chase was clearly insane. His delusions about his body being drained of blood were no doubt real in his mind. He was a paranoid schizophrenic. But did that mean his crimes were committed in the midst of severe delusions? On the stand, now just 107 pounds, his eyes sunken and dark, he admitted to the murders. He had done it all for the blood, but had little memory about the details. He said he was sorry. That's not what most of the public wanted to hear. This man was evil, they said. He deserved to die. The lead prosecutor for the case was Ronald W. Tocherman, and he didn't care much for the defense's plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. He wanted the death penalty for this man who the public was now calling the Vampire of Sacramento. He argued Chase had brought rubber gloves to the scene of his murders, so he planned them as a sane killer might have done. He knew what he was doing. The defense argued back that everything in his profile showed he had a serious mental illness. He hadn't even hidden his crimes, walking around all day covered in blood as people tried to ignore him. He was in effect an invisible killer, an American psycho ignored by his family, his friends, and the state. Chase was almost certainly insane, but the jury saw him as responsible for his actions. After 5 hours of deliberation, on May 8, 1979, they returned a verdict of 6 counts of first-degree murder. It was determined that this so-called vampire's life should end in the gas chamber at San Quentin Penitentiary. However, Chase would ultimately escape the death penalty. At 11:05 a.m. on December 26, 1980, prison guards found Chase dead in his cell. He had overdosed on a drug prescribed for his depression and hallucinations. Nearby, they discovered papers covered in an enigmatic code. leaving behind one final mystery. Dracula was dead, but his case lived on, becoming a textbook example for the FBI of a disorganized killer. On the 1st of February 2012, Samantha Koenig was finishing her shift at the coffee place where she worked. It had been a day like any other for the 18-year-old barista, and since things were quiet, the long, uneventful day winding down, she'd already begun tidying up the Common Ground stand in downtown Anchorage, Alaska. That was when a man approached her, a figure wearing a ski mask, who was set on turning this average day into one unlike any other, ending it in an unspeakable tragedy. The man placed an order for a coffee. Despite it almost being the end of her working day, Samantha obliged and started making his order, expecting that it would be the last one of the day. And in a sense, it would be. While it might seem somewhat unnerving and even possibly a cause for concern to be approached at your place of employment by a stranger wearing a ski mask, most employees at retail outlets or financial services like banks might be expecting that someone with a mask is trying to conceal their identity, possibly so they could rob the establishment. But with the freezing cold temperatures in Alaska, it's hardly an unwarranted assumption that this figure was just trying to keep his face warm. But in actuality, the mask was to keep his face hidden from what was about to happen next. Samantha Koenig finished making the man's coffee and went to hand him the order. Then, without warning, he pulled out a gun. The barista was terrified for her life as the masked figure began to threaten her, demanding she hand over the money from the coffee stand's register. Trying to comply with his demands as quickly as possible, Samantha hurriedly went to empty the cash drawer and give the money to the assailant, only to find that the register was empty. She was perhaps hoping that he'd run off, having failed his attempt at a holdup, leaving her still frightened but ultimately still alive. Sadly, that wasn't what happened. Despite doing as he had instructed, Samantha was then made to put her hands up and kneel down on the ground. She was horrified to see the armed man suddenly dive into the kiosk, forcing his way inside the coffee stand, before grabbing her and using zip ties to bind her hands together. Once he had Samantha tied, her attacker pulled her to her feet and guided her outside to a white Ford Focus that was parked nearby. He took her toward the vehicle and tried to push Samantha inside, which was when she made an attempt to get away from the man. It didn't work. In retaliation, he pressed the barrel of the gun he was holding right against her head and warned that if she tried to escape again, he'd shoot her. Forcing her into the car, the assailant got behind the wheel and drove off, with Samantha in tow, her hands still bound and unable to flee for fear of being killed. The masked figure explained while driving through town that he didn't intend to cause Samantha any harm and that he only kidnapped her to demand a ransom. He told her that as long as she cooperated, she would eventually be returned to her family alive and unharmed. Bringing Samantha to his home, it was here that her kidnapper would hold her captive for several days. He kept her tied up in a shed on his property and turned the radio up to full volume in order to drown out the sound of his captive screaming, preventing any neighbors or passers-by from hearing her cries for help and intervening. Immediately after imprisoning her, the man later drove back to the coffee kiosk he'd taken Samantha from to retrieve her phone. Her boyfriend, Dwayne Tortolani, was due to be picking her up from work after her shift. The kidnapper had initially intended to capture Dwayne too, but had changed his mind and decided only to take Samantha instead. But he still had to cover his tracks and delay his victim's loved ones from discovering that she was missing. So he retrieved Samantha's phone and sent a fake text message to Dwayne telling him, "I'm spending a couple days with friends, let my dad know." The day after the kidnapping, the kidnapper demanded that Samantha give him her address so he could break in and steal her ATM card. She told him where she lived and even that the card was in her boyfriend's truck. So the man made his way over to Samantha's home and broke into Dwayne's truck. Sure enough, there was a debit card right there for the taking, linked to an account that Samantha and her boyfriend shared. The kidnapper pocketed the card and was about to make his exit when somebody spotted him. Dwayne Tortolani had already been on edge since receiving the vague text message from his girlfriend the night before, with no idea that Samantha hadn't been the one to send it. When Dwayne and Samantha's dad, James Koenig, witnessed someone who appeared to be a burglar attempting to steal his truck, they confronted the man, running inside the house to get James's help. But by the time they'd returned, the thief had fled from the scene. Neither Dwayne nor James realized they'd just seen the man responsible for Samantha's disappearance. Once the kidnapper had successfully tested Samantha and Dwayne's debit card, making sure it still worked, he returned to his home and his captive victim. There, he poured himself a tall glass of wine and headed out to his shed, where he violently forced himself on Samantha. Afterward, he strangled her to death. The man who kidnapped and killed Samantha Koenig was named Israel Keys. To those on the outside looking in on the man's life, he was unassuming, just a father to a daughter and a reliable handyman, a contractor, and a construction worker with his own business, Keyes Construction. But since the details of his heinous actions were brought to life, he's been called by some the most meticulous serial killer of the 21st century. Make no mistake, Israel Keyes was a monster wearing the mask of a man and one responsible for a whole laundry list of serious crimes, from burglary and bank robbery to arson, kidnappings, with his serial killings claiming the lives of between 11 and 20 victims, as well as his numerous aggravated sexual assaults added to the already degenerate pile. His crime spree toured the breadth of the United States as early as 1996, only ending after 2012 when the FBI learned about what he'd done to Samantha Koenig, and what they uncovered made them utterly terrified of Israel Keyes. Once he had murdered Samantha, Keyes would leave her body stashed in a cupboard inside the shed where he'd been keeping her prisoner. After all, he had places to be and a flight to catch. The next morning, he woke up his daughter, who was only 11 at the time, and left for the airport. He traveled down from Alaska to New Orleans to board a ship that took him on a pre-planned cruise around the Gulf of Mexico, which lasted for around 2 weeks. At the culmination of the New Orleans cruise, Keyes was starting to get increasingly worried. In the short time he'd been away, his abduction of Samantha had garnered a lot of publicity, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. Rather than returning home directly to Anchorage, Keyes figured that perhaps the best way he could draw attention away from the crime he'd committed back in Alaska was to commit more crimes somewhere else. He began exploring parts of Dallas, Texas, intent on launching a full-blown crime spree. Soon enough, in Aledo, he came across a single-story house. It was a 3,500 square foot property, complete with red bricks and a barn nearby. Once he had successfully robbed the house, Keyes set fire to the barn, burning it to the ground. After arson around Aledo, Keyes drove to another nearby Texas city, this time making a pit stop in Azle. Was he there to take in the local sights? Maybe visit the Ain't That Something antique store? No, he was there to knock over the National Bank of Texas. Putting on sunglasses, a breathing mask, and a hard hat, as well as a pair of gloves, Keyes marched into the bank with the same handgun he used to threaten Samantha Koenig. He brandished the weapon at the teller, robbing the place within approximately 2 minutes and racing off before the police had time to arrive on scene. Later, Keyes would bury the money he'd stolen in a hole that he'd dug in the Post Oak Cemetery, located in Glen Rose, Texas. Still on his return journey back to Alaska and still mid-crime spree, Keyes even came close to carrying out yet another kidnapping. While he was in an area of Texas just south of Cleburne, he spotted a woman who was out walking her dog. For a moment, Keyes considered abducting her too, and even almost did, but ultimately quickly gave up on that plan and instead focused on making his way back to Anchorage. On the 17th of February 2012, Keyes arrived back home in Alaska. Now, while it might seem that his original plan to kidnap and hold Samantha for ransom was just a lie Keyes told the teenager while he abducted her, that was still very much his intention, and the fact that he'd already murdered Samantha wasn't about to stop him from trying to get his hands on the ransom money. At the time, after all, despite the publicity her disappearance had drummed up, the police and the Koenig family had no clue that Samantha was already dead. So Keyes enacted arguably one of the most horrific parts of his twisted plan. He took Samantha's lifeless body out of the cupboard he left her in, then applied makeup to her frozen face. Unsettlingly, he sewed her eyes with a fishing line so they would stay open, giving the impression that his victim was still alive. He then wrote a ransom note demanding that $30,000 be deposited into the shared account belonging to Samantha and her boyfriend. Keyes still had the ATM card for the account in his possession, which would allow him to withdraw money should the family accept his demands. Then he snapped a Polaroid of Samantha's body, giving the appearance of still being alive, and holding up a 4-day-old issue of the Anchorage Daily newspaper. Having it visible in the frame proved the photo had been taken recently and would, according to Keyes' plan, make it seem like the deceased woman was still alive. Both the photo of her body and the note containing his ransom demand were then left at an Anchorage park underneath a memorial flyer for a dog named Albert. This was where Keyes instructed Dwayne Tortolani to look for further instructions using Samantha's phone. The message ominously read, "Connor Park sign, under pic of Albert, ain't she purty?" A few days after leaving the photo and a ransom note for Dwayne to find, Keyes disposed of Samantha's body. He drove her out to Matanuska Lake, a lake just north of Anchorage that was covered with a sheet of ice during this time of year. Taking Samantha's body out of his truck, Keyes then meticulously dismembered her corpse using a chainsaw before cutting a hole in the ice and dumping her severed remains in the freezing lake. Around this time, Dwayne found the ransom note left in Connor Park and shared it with Samantha's father, James. as well as the rest of the family. Believing Samantha was still alive, deceived by Keyes' sickening photo of her body, James deposited the requested sum of $30,000 into the account that Keyes now had access to. Members of the local community had generously donated as much as they could to help, sparing the Koenigs from paying the entire ransom out of pocket. But of course, this was all done under the false assumption that Samantha would be returned to them if they coughed up the cash to Keyes. The killer and kidnapper started accessing Samantha and Dwayne's shared accounts and gradually withdrawing the ransom money from the 6th of March onward. This alerted Alaskan police, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Given the severe nature of the crime committed, the FBI had also begun to investigate the case, and as a result, they were monitoring any activity on the account where the ransom money had been deposited. Shortly after Keyes started collecting his ill-gotten gains, he started making his way through the southwestern states. In Alaska, he was not only too close to where he'd left Samantha's body, but staying in one place would make it easier for police to catch up with him. This did little to deter the authorities from tracking where in the southwestern U.S. he was making the numerous withdrawals of ransom money. Authorities in Alaska had made the controversial decision not to release the surveillance footage of Samantha's abduction to the public, which is often done to encourage citizens to come forward with any relevant information if they recognize familiar figures or details from the footage of a crime under investigation. However, without the assistance of the public, police were able to determine that the man responsible for both the kidnapping of Samantha Koenig and the robbery at the National Bank of Texas had been driving a white 2012 Ford Focus. Officers in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were alerted to keep an eye on a vehicle that matched the description. The car that Keyes had been using was a rental vehicle. Somewhat ironically, he tried to obtain a replacement to better cover his tracks, only to receive another Ford Focus, the same model and even the same color. This would eventually lead to the authorities arresting him after a Texas Highway Patrol officer spotted Keyes and the vehicle on the 13th of March. The officer alerted Texas police and began following the white car onto Highway 59, having noticed that the driver was traveling above the speed limit. The Highway Patrol officer made his presence known to Keyes, getting the kidnapper to pull over to the side of the road. The moment he stopped, a fleet of unmarked vehicles raced to the scene, federal agents and Texas Rangers pouring out of their cars and surrounding him. Israel Keyes had nowhere left to run. In a quick search of the murderous car later, authorities had found Samantha Koenig's debit card along with her cell phone, which Keyes had removed the battery from to prevent it from being traced. Also in the car were a ski mask, Keyes' gun, and cash that he'd taken from the National Bank of Texas, distinguishable by the anti-theft dye that stained the bills. Keyes also had maps of California, Arizona, and New Mexico, with certain areas highlighted. Israel Keyes was subsequently arrested at the scene and indicted in a federal holding facility located in Beaumont, Texas. On the 26th of March, he was returned to Anchorage and confessed to murdering Samantha Koenig. During subsequent interviews with the police, Keyes conducted himself with an unsettling level of calm and patience, even offering up terms to the authorities in exchange for confessions of his various other crimes. It turned out that, unbeknownst to law enforcement, Samantha Koenig was not Keyes' first victim. He offered to divulge the information regarding the crimes he had committed and even agreed that he would plead guilty to any and all charges that were brought against him. But Keyes laid out that he'd only agree to do so as long as his trial lasted less than a year and that he was sentenced to execution at the end of it. Naturally, police don't, or certainly shouldn't, be able to influence the outcome of the judicial process, so promising a specific outcome in Keyes' trial was a little far out of the police's jurisdiction. Still, federal investigators eventually struck a deal with Israel Keyes to learn about where the bodies of his other potential prior victims were hidden. Keyes willingly agreed to reveal all, but there was one other important caveat to his doing so. He didn't want the public or the media to know any of the details about his crimes, because Keyes didn't want his daughter to learn about what he had done to Samantha. On the 2nd of April 2012, 2 months and a day after she had been kidnapped at work, Samantha Koenig's remains were recovered from Matanuska Lake. What Keyes had done to her ultimately led to him being discovered and resulted in his eventual downfall, with some federal agents even being convinced that had Keyes not kidnapped and murdered Samantha, he might never have been caught at all. As the information he later revealed to authorities would confirm, Israel Keyes' criminal exploits had been going on much longer than anyone realized. His vile actions were more akin to the villain of a horror movie than an actual human being. The FBI realized they weren't dealing with an opportunistic murderer, but a cold, calculating, highly methodical, and downright terrifying serial killer. So who exactly was Israel Keyes? How had a man guilty of so much violence and murder been able to avoid being found? Where does a monster like that even come from? Well, this specific monster was born in Richmond, Utah in 1978. The Keyes family home, the second child of 9 siblings, certainly got crowded after his parents, John Jeffrey Keyes and Heidi Hackinson, had him. Keyes was raised Mormon, although he would often attend a Christian church that espoused white supremacist beliefs. As if being exposed to a hateful ideology at such a young age wasn't enough to turn Keyes into a monster, he seemed to adopt a fixation with weapons in his early adolescence. From the age of 14, he would walk around everywhere with a .38 caliber revolver that his grandfather gave him. As a child, Keyes outfitted the weapon with his very own homemade silencer and began killing pet animals in true child destined to be a serial killer fashion. His propensity for burglary would also begin around this time when he and a friend would break into local houses and steal valuables. By 1995, at the age of around 17, Keyes started working with a construction crew up until the late 90s when his family moved to Maine. It was there that he'd announced to his parents he was an atheist, leading to him being kicked out of the home of his highly religious family. But it was around this time in his life, some point between 96 and 1998, that Keyes would commit his first serious crime, and it was a grim warning of the type of heinous act he'd spend much of his life carrying out. A hiking group had been making their way along the Deschutes River near Maupin, Oregon, when they noticed that one of their members, a girl, had gone missing. The group started to search the surrounding area, attempting to track the missing hiker down. But as it turned out, Israel Keyes had found her first. Keyes abducted the girl from the other hikers and then forced himself on her. Later, he released her, although he had intended to murder her, until she convinced him to let her leave. It seems he wasn't yet adding kidnapping and killing to his already deplorable modus operandi, although he would later be quoted as saying, "I wasn't violent enough. I made up my mind I was never going to let that happen again." In 1998, Keyes enlisted in the U.S. Army after relocating to New Jersey and would serve as a specialist within Alpha Company's 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry. He trained in Egypt, spending much of his service in Fort Hood, Texas, and near Tacoma, Washington, over in Fort Lewis. He earned an Army Achievement Medal for his meritorious service while he had been assigned as a gunner, manning a 60mm mortar between December 1998 and July 2001. In May 2001, Keyes encountered legal trouble when he was charged with driving under the influence in Thurston County, Washington. Compounding the issue, authorities discovered that his driving license had already been suspended, resulting in an additional charge for driving with a suspended license. Though less severe than his other offenses, these infractions led to his dishonorable discharge from the U.S. Army later that year. While discharge from the armed forces would be devastating to some, for Keyes it offered him a chance to pursue his true passion. His new lease on life was largely focused on ending other people's lives. Upon his arrest, he confessed to the FBI that shortly after his military discharge, he took the lives of his first murder victims, a couple whose identity still remains unverified. In 2000, Keyes became involved with a woman living on the Washington Makah Reservation, and their daughter was born a year later. By the following year, 2002, Keyes had separated from the still unnamed woman and took his daughter away to live with him. Then, as of 2006, he began taking a number of travels away, visiting parts of California, Washington, and New England, never specifying the reason as to why. When he made his confession to law enforcement in 2012, Keyes was confirmed to have committed a number of burglaries, taking place in between 20 to 30 different homes, as well as conducting robberies in several other banks. The time he robbed the National Bank of Texas certainly wasn't a one and done. One of the most notable of those took place in 2009, when Keyes decided that in order to finance his crimes, the quickest way to secure some funds was to rob a bank, as one does naturally. He had allegedly abducted and killed a man in New York not long before. Then, on April 10, 2009, Keyes made his way toward the community bank. He was said to have been wearing a jacket and jeans, gray shoes, two-tone gloves, sunglasses, and a fake mustache and goatee to complete the look. Oh, and a couple of accessories, a .40 caliber semi-automatic Smith & Wesson handgun, and a .22 caliber Ruger Charger pistol as a spare. Heading inside with his weapons at the ready, he successfully made off with the cash he needed. However, rather than get spending, Keyes had a different approach. Stashing the stolen money in a toolbox, he then buried it in the Woodside Natural area of Essex, Vermont. Along with the cash, he buried both his Smith & Wesson and Ruger Charger, along with homemade silencers, ligatures, ammunition for both guns, and some garbage bags. 4 days later, he flew back home and made several repeat travels across America over the next 2 years. In 2011, he flew to Indiana, then drove to New York, and later back to Vermont. Recovering his hidden toolbox, he prepared to target and murder another victim as a prelude to another bank robbing spree, with maybe some arson thrown in as an added treat. prowling around suburban neighborhoods late on the 8th of July 2011, Keyes eventually set his sights on Bill and Lorraine Currier. Having observed which room of the house the couple were asleep in, Keyes cut their phone lines and broke inside. He then enacted what he would later call a blitz attack on the Curriers, ambushing them as they slept, tying them up and then driving them out to an abandoned farmhouse that he'd previously found in the area. After shooting Bill Currier with a .22 caliber Ruger, Keyes forced himself on Lorraine before strangling her. Neither of their bodies were ever found. Where Keyes was different from many other serial killers was exactly how he went about conducting his crimes. Rather than attacking victims spontaneously, he instead meticulously planned out each of his murders, spending ample time and taking extreme caution to avoid detection. And it seemed to work for almost his entire killing career, since the police and the FBI didn't make any headway in even discovering his crimes until he kidnapped and killed Samantha Koenig in 2012. What also made him far more difficult to track down than other serial killers was that there was little linking Keyes' various victims, even the ones that authorities had actually found. Statistically, murders are typically carried out by somebody that the victim is considerably familiar with, or a person who is at least known to the deceased. But when it came to Keyes, he had no prior connection whatsoever with any of his victims. The idea of a total stranger just deciding, apropos of nothing, that they're going to end your life because you just happened to cross their path is genuinely the stuff of paranoid nightmares. Keyes would lie in wait and search for victims in parks, cemeteries, campgrounds, or other similarly isolated areas away from the prying eyes of potential witnesses or surveillance cameras that are far more common in populated urban areas. When describing his reasoning to the police, he explained that there weren't as many people to choose from in areas like these. He confessed to law enforcement that the lack of anyone else around to see what he was doing was what drew him to the places and the people he targeted. There's also no witnesses, really. There's no one else around. He never went after victims that fit a specific profile, targeting men and women, although when interviewed by police in 2012, he claimed that he considered children and their parents to be off-limits. How altruistic of him. Despite these claims, the FBI still suspected Keyes had been involved with the killing of several teenagers and children. In addition, the fact that Keyes moved around a lot, constantly traveling away to enact his brutal acts, made it initially hard to link his crimes to each other. If a death occurs in Vermont and another takes place in Washington, it might be considered by police to be a bit of a leap to assume the same person did them, let alone entertain the idea that they were the work of a notorious serial killer. State to state, unless making requests for relevant information, police departments might not even be aware of the crimes committed elsewhere in the country. Keyes would always enact his killings far away from wherever he currently called home, and would never murder someone in the same area twice, making it even harder to connect what must have looked like several separate deaths, especially when he killed with no apparent motive or discernible pattern. Months of preparation and planning went into his attacks. During his various trips to different states, he would only pay in normally stolen cash and kept his cell phone switched off at all times. Once Keyes had selected a victim at random, he would bury a quote murder kit somewhere in the area where his target was, just like he did before killing the Curriers. Some of these kits have been recovered in parts of Alaska and New York, but Keyes also confessed that he had stashed others across Washington, Wyoming, Texas, and Arizona. Also, according to his confessions, he rarely used firearms, relying on them to carry out a killing only when he had to. Keyes admitted to deriving a lot of pleasure from watching his victims lose consciousness in a struggle, preferring instead to strangle them to death. When the police questioned him as he confessed to his crimes, Keyes revealed one of the core details that made the FBI so afraid of him. He'd studied the crimes of other serial killers. According to Keyes, in his youth, he had read Mindhunter inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit, a book that features profiles of various serial killers from a former FBI agent, and since then had developed an affinity for his fellow killers. In one interview, investigators mentioned Robert Hansen, another serial killer who happened to have also been active in Anchorage, Alaska, between 1972 and 1983, otherwise known as the Butcher Baker. Hearing mention of Hansen, Keyes enthusiastically told authorities, "Yeah, I know all about him. I probably know every single serial killer that's ever been written about. It's kind of a hobby of mine." In particular, it was said that he deeply admired Ted Bundy, even claiming that he saw himself in him and shared many similarities with the notorious murderer. While it was true that Keyes and Bundy were both methodical and operated in multiple U.S. states, they clearly differed in how they chose their victims and how they operated. Even though part of the reason Keyes didn't want his name given to the media was to avoid being labeled as a copycat of his serial killer role model, He would even go so far as to try to imitate Bundy's escape from court later in 2012, but was immediately seized by guards. Keyes didn't hold all his fellow serial killers in such high regard, though. He said of Dennis Rader, also known as BTK, that he was a wimp for showing remorse for his killings. Keyes expressed the most admiration for other serial killers who hadn't been caught like he very nearly was. One homicide detective from Anchorage, Detective Monique Dahl, said that Keyes didn't kidnap and kill people because he was crazy. He didn't kidnap and kill people because his deity told him to, or because he had a bad childhood. He did this because he got an immense amount of enjoyment out of it. Much like an addict gets an immense amount of enjoyment out of drugs. In a way, he was an addict, and he was addicted to the feeling that he got when he was out doing this. When investigators asked Keyes why he had committed his crimes, he simply replied by asking them, why not? It wouldn't be until August 2013, over a year after he had killed Samantha Koenig, that federal authorities released information about Israel Keyes to the public. They announced that he was suspected to have a grand total of 11 slain victims, each having been killed between 2001 and 2012. There was also speculation that he'd claimed the lives of even more people, possibly up in Canada, where Keyes had often targeted prostitutes, as well as potential killings he'd committed in other countries. However, these were either too far out of federal jurisdiction or happened too long ago for the FBI to be able to fully substantiate them. Israel Keyes was said to have a body count of at least 11 innocent people, although he confessed to as many as 20. Still, only 3 of his victims have ever been confirmed and formally identified, those being the Couriers, Bill and Lorraine, and Samantha Koenig. There exists an entire list of speculated Keyes additional victims too, including multiple teenage girls from Colville found dead in 1997, the Lewis County Jane Doe found in 2011 in Morton, and a body that was ruled as an accidental drowning in a lake in Nia Bay. And those are just the possible victims from Washington. When information about him was released to the public, Keyes became uncooperative with investigators and threatened to stop speaking with the FBI entirely. During a routine court hearing in 2012, he even became violent, which was when he was able to escape confinement and attempted to attack spectators in the courtroom. Following this, security measures were increased. Keyes had an escort of 2 officers every time he left his cell, full restraints, and daily strip searches since there were no restrictions on what items he could have in his possession, such as pencils and, crucially, razors. Yet despite these measures, he was still able to sneak a razor blade on his person, which was believed to have been issued to him by mistake, since he was only authorized to shave with an electric razor. On December 2, 2012, Keyes wrote a 2-page note before using a combination of the razor and hanging to end his own life. While he was never formally sentenced for his numerous crimes, Israel Keyes at least faced some kind of justice, no longer able to harm anybody else. It's April 21, 2005 at ADX Florence, America's Supermax prison. Located deep in the Colorado mountains, and also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, inmates there spend 23 hours a day in soundproof 7 by 12-foot cells, designed to prevent them from making any meaningful contact with the outside world, or with each other. It's where the most violent and dangerous inmates in the country are housed, and because of this, the staff takes extreme measures to ensure the prisoners' safety, including constant video surveillance, especially when they gather outside for recreation time. And on this particular day, despite everything being seemingly routine that morning, the guards noticed something odd. There in the back corner of the yard, an area surrounded by 12-foot-high concrete walls topped with razor wire, was an inmate, lying bloodied and motionless. But how could a prisoner in the most tightly controlled prison in the US get murdered in broad daylight? And even when it turned out that that murder had been caught on camera, why did it take nearly 10 years to solve? This is what we're going to find out. Jose Guadian, a guard at ADX Florence, arrived at his job watching security monitors just after 7 a.m. After his partner showed up, they ensured all the monitors were recording and then began scanning for anything suspicious. You see, rec time is where the inmates go about a lot of their illicit business. This is because inmates at ADX Florence spend almost the entire day locked up in their cells, which are built from reinforced concrete and equipped with sliding doors operated remotely by the guards. Every cell has its own narrow slit of a window, angled so that the sky is the only thing visible, preventing inmates from establishing any kind of connection to the outside world. Meals are delivered through small slots and showers are automated within the cells, all to minimize human contact. and reduce the risk of violent incidents. This meant that rec time is one of their few opportunities to break the rules. Exchanging drugs, passing notes, and handing off weapons were all things Jose and his partner would be watching for. Just before 8 o'clock, the first groups of inmates began walking into the rec yard. As prisoners start doing push-ups, burpees, and other calisthenic exercises, Jose and his partner scanned the hands and the feet of the inmates, looking to see if anyone passed or dropped anything. The pair continued scanning until at 8:21 a.m. they spotted an inmate lying motionless in the far corner of the rec yard. After confirming with his partner that what they were looking at was real, the pair phoned the head of prison control, Paul Middleton. Paul immediately called a security alert. As soon as he did, every door in the prison slammed shut, except for a set that ran directly to the rec yard. With sirens blaring all around him, Paul wheeled a giant cart full of non-lethal weapons outside of his office. Every officer that ran by could grab a pepperball gun, a beanbag rifle, a baton, anything they needed to face the inmates. As guards in the facility responded and made their way into the prison yard, they didn't immediately rush in. Instead, they formed a perimeter around the yard. This is because prison rules dictated in these scenarios, guards must maintain a 3-to-1 balance of power over the inmates. The prisoners at ADX Florence are so dangerous, and with so many of them in the yard, they couldn't risk being overwhelmed. So instead, the officers began to call them one by one to walk backward toward the prison walls, where individual prisoners could then be handcuffed and brought back into their cells. Only once enough inmates had been removed like this would the ratio of guards to prisoners be high enough that officers could clear the rec yard. Medical staff, though, did immediately make their way to the downed inmate, and what they found shocked everyone. There, lying in a pool of his own blood, was an inmate who was so beaten that when medical staff tried to identify him, they couldn't, since his face was completely covered in bruises. When they attempted to identify brain functioning by shining a light in his pupils, they were unable to do so since his eyes were swollen shut. Medical staff later commented that his injuries were akin to what they had seen from people who had jumped from a nearby Royal Gorge Bridge, which was a 1,000-foot fall. Though medical staff could not get a pulse, they began CPR and they called for an ambulance. The prisoner was declared deceased at the hospital, but it is likely he died while still at the prison. As the prisoner was being transported into the hospital, though, correctional officers were busy bringing inmates to their cells, and that's when they got their first clue. Guards noticed that one of the prisoners, Richard Chuco Santiago, had blood all over his shoes. When they realized the significance of this, they came back to his cell and seized his clothing. But when they got there, Santiago was busy dunking his clothes and shoes into his prison toilet. Guards ordered him to stop, but he ignored them and started washing them faster. When threatened with a forceful extraction to stop him from destroying potential evidence, Santiago finally allowed the officers to handcuff him, and they entered his cell. As this was happening, prison officials were also reviewing the video recordings to see if the cameras had picked up anything. In ADX Florence, nearly every inch of the facility is under constant surveillance, with the video feeds running 24/7. During the video review, the officers finally discovered the identity of the victim. His name was Manuel Tati Torres, and he was a known leader of the Mexican Mafia. The tape showed Torres doing some toe touches in the back corner of the yard when two men came into the frame. The first was Santiago, the man who had been caught cleaning his clothes in his cell, and the second was another inmate named Sylvester Chicale Rivera. As Santiago approached Torres, Torres extended his hand as if to shake Santiago's, when all of a sudden Santiago cocked back his fist and punched Torres in the face. The first blow knocked him to the ground and just out of view of the camera, but Santiago and Rivera could still be seen punching, kicking, and stomping Torres for a full 6 minutes. The killers were so brazen and nonchalant about the attack that during the assault, Santiago even took a quick breather to grab a drink of water before going back in on Torres. The next day, officers went to Rivera's cell to detain him. When officers arrived, he was visibly shaking but cooperative. As he was being led away, he asked if the deputies were mad about what he did. When they didn't respond, he asked about what had happened in the rec yard yesterday, wanting to know if it was truly the first time a murder had happened at ADX Florence. "What I did," he said. "I heard it made the news." Not wanting to taint any additional statements, the corrections officers advised Rivera to stop talking and wait for the investigators to come. But who exactly were these people, how did they know each other, and why did they want to murder one of them? All three men were affiliated with the Mexican Mafia, which was born out of the cesspit that was the California Juvenile Detention Program in the 1950s. And the whole idea behind the gang was to unite Mexican-American gang members under one common banner while in jail. The gang recruited heavily and based their operation on the Italian mafias that were prominent in the American Northeast at the time. The organization had strict rules. Members had to follow all orders from made members no matter what, up to and including murder. Backing down from a fight, snitching, or trying to leave the gang were all grounds for immediate execution. And soon the gang's hyperfixation on extreme violence earned it a fearsome reputation. So much so that the California prison authorities tried to clamp down on the organization by dispersing the gang to other parts of the state. But that ended up having the opposite effect. Like a cancer, the Mexican Mafia, which was now spread out, only grew more powerful. Over the years, as members made parole, they established sects throughout California, where they continued their drug trafficking, prostitution, extortion, and murder-for-hire rackets on the outside. The Mexican Mafia, now known as La M, or the M in Spanish, became an extremely powerful gang both inside and outside the California prison system. Its core membership consisted of around 750 made members who controlled up to 50,000 associates and foot soldiers at any given time, who all had aspirations to become a full-fledged member. And the only way to do that was to commit a murder in the name of the gang. So where did these three men fall in this organization? Manuel Torres was a senior leader in the organization, first joining the gang in the 1960s. He quickly became a powerful figure in Southern California. His main racket was an extortion business that charged drug dealers and drug users a tax to buy and use drugs in his territory. He would then take a percentage of the cut and send it back to incarcerated members to help them live a more comfortable life on the inside. In 1997, Torres was one of several dozen Mexican Mafia members arrested in a giant operation. At first, Torres was sent away to do his time at Lompoc, a federal institution several hundred miles away from Los Angeles. However, once at Lompoc, Torres united all the Hispanic gangs on the yard under the banner of La M and began terrorizing the other prisoners. After running out of options to limit his power, state prison officials decided the only way to beat Torres was to ship him off to ADX Florence, where he could hopefully be controlled. As for Santiago, he was a fully made member of the Mexican Mafia and, like Torres, had also been imprisoned at Lompoc. A career criminal, Santiago earned his way into the Mexican Mafia by killing a fellow inmate in 1989, which got him a life sentence. Continuing to be unruly, he was eventually shipped off to ADX Florence in 2000, and he and Torres arrived there around the same time. Then there was Sylvester Rivera. Rivera was a longtime associate of the Mexican Mafia, a career bank robber who brought in huge sums of cash for the group, but had not been made a full member yet. After getting caught, Rivera continued to break prison rules in every institution he was at, from using drugs to making contraband wine, fighting, and trying to escape. Rivera was a problem child no matter where he went. After dealing with him for years, it was decided ADX Florence was the only place for him, and he arrived in March 2005. But even though all of these men were bad guys, it was still a homicide. The truth needed to be found out. But because the institution was federal property, the FBI would handle the investigation. And the person in charge of finding out the truth was a man who will only be known as John. In order to keep his identity a secret, John has only revealed a few details about who he was. He would later tell a reporter who investigated the case his first name, that he grew up in a very Christian southern town, and he came from a large police family. All other details had to be limited to protect himself and his family, and the reporter would soon learn why this was the case. After being assigned the case, John first went to the facility to speak to the inmates who were in the yard that day. As he made his way to the prison complex, an immense feeling of dread came over him. The complex was situated in an absolutely beautiful part of Colorado, surrounded by picturesque mountains, but the facility itself was ominous, cold, and eerily quiet. When John arrived, he asked the prison officials if they had an interview room he could use to speak to the inmates. They told him yes, they did, but no, he couldn't use it. You see, one of the worst things a prisoner can do is talk to a cop. The others see it as a betrayal, and so even the suggestion that someone had spoken to him about the murder and potentially snitched in any capacity would be enough to get them killed. John would have to come up with another way to speak with the inmates without letting the others know. To protect their confidentiality, John set up a makeshift office in a secluded part of the prison. Correction officers would take away one prisoner at a time with a made-up reason for their removal. This could be under the pretext of a doctor's appointment, a meeting with an attorney, a dental appointment, or some other mundane reason. But despite this, it didn't take long for the prisoners to figure out what was going on. One time, after several prisoners had been brought in under the guise of a dental appointment, other prisoners remarked that they didn't realize they had so many issues with their teeth. And just because they weren't talking to John in the official interrogation room, that didn't mean they would be any more cooperative. After the guards sat down the potential witnesses, many would unleash a flurry of profanities as soon as John flashed his FBI badge. Others remained even more defiant, and they refused to say a single word at all, and they would stare at John in silence until he gave up. In fact, during John's visit to ADX Florence, not a single inmate made any statement whatsoever about what happened that day, nor anything about Torres, Santiago, or Rivera. It seemed as if the entire population of several hundred inmates had either been sworn to secrecy about what happened, or they had been threatened. Either way, John realized he wasn't going to get anything out of them, and he was forced to leave ADX Florence empty-handed. But John wouldn't give up that easily. Not willing to be defeated, he teamed up with the assistant U.S. attorney Bob Midens, a career prosecutor who had made a name for himself in the Denver office as someone who could take on even the most complex legal cases and win. Together, he and John devised a new strategy to try to figure out what had happened, but they would need expert help to do this. The experts they chose were members of the FBI field office in Los Angeles. Here, the Intelligence Bureau had several resident experts on La M, and they knew practically all the players. When the duo met with the FBI officials in Los Angeles, they were stunned at the amount of information they had gathered on the gang. Inside the FBI office, there was a literal library of information documenting nearly every crime and every member of the group that they knew of. Not having much time, they received permission to copy most of the documents there and bring them back to Colorado for review. But that wasn't the only thing the FBI gave them there. In addition to the documents, they handed over a list of former Mexican Mafia members who had turned state witness for various trials. These former gangsters had signed their own death warrants because of this, and they were all put into the Federal Witness Protection Program. As part of the deal to help them, the FBI field office in LA gave John and Bob a list of Mexican Mafia defectors. However, they did not give them information on what they had done in their previous lives, nor did they promise their cooperation. But this was still their best shot at understanding La M and why Torres might have been marked for death. With that, John and Bob went on a countrywide tour, interviewing ex-gangsters to figure out the truth. Though many were unwilling to involve themselves, they did speak to enough people to learn the following secrets about the gang. In La M, once you're marked for death, it doesn't matter if the decision was made months, years, or even decades ago, it was still a valid order. Members marked for death never knew what was coming, and because Mexican Mafia members were spread throughout prisons in the U.S., it could take a long time for word to pass from member to member confirming the hit. Once enough members had voted for death, word could travel via messengers throughout various prisons or on the outside. Because of this, it could literally take years before a member is released to relay a message on the outside. This is because, unlike other gangs, which sometimes have documents showing written rules or orders, the Mexican Mafia keeps no records. All confidential information is locked inside one place only, the members' minds, and it is only passed by word of mouth. So what had the defectors had to say about this case in particular? What cardinal sin of La M had he broken? According to them, the reason why Torres had been marked for death was because back in the early 90s, as he was taking over his extortion business, he had killed a fellow member to have it all for himself. It took several years for other members to find out Torres was behind the murder, and by the time they did, he had already been arrested in 1997 and then shipped off to ADX Florence in 2000. So, who was Santiago? It's been claimed that he was what's known as a torpedo. Torpedoes were hitmen specifically designated to carry out assassinations of marked men inside the prison system. So, for Santiago to be sent from Lompoc to ADX Florence around the same time as Torres shows that it is very possible his murder was planned years in advance. But how did Rivera fit into all of this? Because Rivera was not yet a fully made member, he needed to commit a murder to finish his gang initiation. In addition to this, Santiago would have to receive a verbal order from outside ADX Florence to confirm the kill order and then execute it with Rivera. Based on their witnesses, John and Ryan speculated that Rivera was a messenger who brought the order to Santiago, since within 3 weeks of Rivera arriving at ADX Florence, Torres was dead. Armed with this expert testimony and the treasure trove of documents provided by the LA field office, not to mention the video of the murder itself, the pair brought a 2-count murder indictment against Santiago and Rivera in 2010. But that is where the real hard work started. Because these prisoners were already serving time in the most brutal prison in America, the U.S. attorneys wanted to send a message to dissuade other inmates from committing extreme acts of violence. But how would they convince other prisoners who had nothing else to lose? After a year of investigation, the Justice Department's Capital Crimes Unit, or Death Squad as it's known, came back with their findings. The United States would seek the death penalty against Santiago and Rivera to dissuade similar crimes in the future. But there was just one problem: Rivera was a Mexican citizen. Under the Vienna Convention, Rivera had to be apprised of his right to counsel immediately upon apprehension for the crime, which corrections officers did not do when they took him from his cell. And while this might not have seemed like a big deal, to the nation of Mexico it was, and soon the Mexican ambassador actually got involved. He wrote letters to the Attorney General and the Secretary of State about Rivera's case. Because Mexico had abolished the death penalty, trying to seek it against a Mexican citizen was a very hot-button political issue. So under political pressure, Bob announced that he would not be seeking the death penalty against Rivera, but would continue to do so against Santiago. But then disaster struck. After working on the case for years, Bob suffered a sudden heart attack while skiing with his wife and died. John took the death of someone who had now become his close friend very hard. Because of Bob's passing, John recused himself from the case. In Bob's stead, U.S. Attorney M.J. Mendez took over. But who could help? Who had the knowledge of the case needed to finish it and get the final convictions? Sometimes you don't have to look very far at all, since it turned out that John had married a fellow FBI agent. After watching her husband handle the case for years, she had become intimately familiar with it, as she had been a sounding board for her husband. With John no longer having the heart to continue after Bob's passing, his wife picked up where he left off and worked with Mendez to prepare the Rivera case for trial. But there was still a big problem. Due to the secretive nature of the Mexican mafia and the government's inability to bring their confidential informants to court, the theory that John and Bob had developed about a hit that was years in the making, while sound, was no good in court. Due to the lack of hard evidence to prove the conspiracy theory, the prosecution wanted to rely on what they could prove, namely the videotape showing the attack. As the trial kicked off, there were some extreme security measures taken to protect all of those involved from reprisals from this shadowy quasi-terrorist organization. Each of the jurors was impaneled in secret. Their faces were not shown in court, and a 4-digit number was used for their identification. As for Rivera, he was shackled to a bucket filled with concrete and flanked by numerous U.S. Marshals ready to tackle him should he try to escape or do anything out of line. But just before the trial kicked off, Rivera's defense team brought up a surprise piece of evidence: an eyewitness. Over the past 10 years, the government had not been able to procure a single statement from anyone in the yard that day. But now, all of a sudden, before the trial, the defense team had found a prisoner who was suddenly willing to testify about the attack. There was a chance he could unravel the whole case against Rivera. So, how did the government claim the murder went down? According to them, Rivera had been sitting in his cell waiting on his turn to go out into the rec yard that morning. Due to an administrative error, the guards did not take him out at the correct time, and so Rivera had flagged down a passing guard to take him out to the rec yard. Meanwhile, video footage had captured Santiago walking up to a window and talking into it. Further investigation by John using drawings of the prison had proven that Santiago had been talking into Rivera's cell while he waited to get taken outside. Once outside, the duo began warming up for their workout in the same corner as Torres, as seen in the video footage. Santiago approached Torres and cold-cocked him, and then the two spent the next 6 minutes beating him to death. But this was a vastly different story from what the new defense witness testified about. Another full-fledged Mexican mafia member named Arcadio Perez came forward as the new witness. According to Perez, this is what happened. Perez said that Torres had apparently passed him a note stating that Rivera was disrespectful and had to be dealt with, and that because Rivera was not a made member, he could kill him with impunity. Perez later testified that these were not empty threats. According to him, Torres ordered Perez that at the rec yard that morning, they were going to attack and kill Rivera. At the signal of "let's go," they would pounce on him and beat him to death right there in the yard. For his part, Perez didn't want to do it. He said that he and Rivera were friends and he honestly liked the guy. However, Torres was a ranking member in the gang. Disobeying his order would mean a death sentence for himself. But was there any truth to what he was saying? Well, maybe. According to prison records, Torres had utilized an inmate intercom system to talk to the guards that morning. Prisoners used this system since the guards didn't stay on the rec yard when they were out there. From guard testimony, Torres had been asking about where Rivera was. Because of this, it did seem odd that Torres was asking for Rivera, and the fact lends some credence to what Perez was saying. But why didn't he follow through? Perez stated that when he saw Santiago approach Torres and start fighting him, he backed off because now it was a dispute between two main members and he was not going to get himself involved. As a result of this, he stayed on the sidelines. But what did Rivera have to say about all of this? Much to everyone's surprise, Rivera took the stand in his own defense, and what he said had a ring of truth to it. According to Rivera, Torres didn't like him because he was close friends with several members Torres didn't like, likely because they were associated with the man Torres had murdered back in the early 90s. Because of this, Torres threatened Rivera's life on numerous occasions. Now, part of that does make some sense. Torres probably wanted everyone to forget about what he had done in the 90s. With several other ranking Mexican Mafia members imprisoned at ADX Florence, the fact that Rivera probably knew what Torres did scared him about what would happen if Rivera began running his mouth. For his part, Rivera denied that he was a messenger who had helped organize the murder. In fact, he said he was the one defending himself. Rivera stated that Santiago took the wannabe gangster under his wing and vowed to protect him. On the day of the murder, he said that Torres had threatened his life again and wanted to fight him. However, Santiago took the initiative by using the ruse to talk to Torres, but instead started fighting him. Rivera then jumped in to help finish off Torres. In Rivera's mind, he wanted the world to believe that if he had not helped kill Torres that day, then he would be the one who ended up dead. There were two sides to the story, and so with that, the jury went off to deliberate and decide on Rivera's fate. As the two sides eagerly awaited a verdict, they returned a question to the court. The jury asked if it was permissible to consider a lesser charge than first-degree murder. This was a good sign for both camps. For the prosecutors, it meant that they believed Rivera had committed a criminal act, and for the defense, it meant a lesser charge. However, before the trial started, Rivera, against the advice of his attorneys, stated he did not want any other charge other than first-degree murder considered. This was because of his advanced age. Already in his late 50s by now, even a conviction of second-degree murder would be a de facto life sentence for him. With just a few more years left on his armed robbery convictions, Rivera was hoping to be a free man soon to enjoy his retirement. Because of that, the judge ordered that the jury could only consider a first-degree murder charge and nothing else. Soon after that, the verdict came back. As the aged gangster rose to hear his fate, he had a slight smile on his face as he anticipated an acquittal. But that smile soon faded when he heard the verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. It had taken years, but they finally got their man when the jury delivered a guilty verdict. And for a bit of poetic justice, the verdict came almost exactly 10 years to the day after the murder had taken place. When the jury members were questioned later as to how they reached their decision, they said that if the case were really about self-defense, why would Rivera and Santiago keep kicking and stomping Torres even after he was down? After the first few minutes, their point would have been made to back off. Everything afterward was unnecessary. Several months after Rivera's conviction, he learned of his fate. For the crime of first-degree murder, he would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. Of course, Rivera maintained his innocence at the time and continues to maintain his innocence to this day, claiming it was a self-defense case. But what about his co-defendant? In order to avoid the death penalty, Santiago skipped the trial and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in December 2016. He was soon also given an additional life sentence without parole. But despite the convictions, there were no winners here. Even though Torres was himself a monster, he was still a father with children and other family members who loved him. For him to meet such a violent end served no justice to either his own family or the family of his victims, since he had not been sentenced to death for his crimes. As for the police, despite obtaining convictions for the two killers, the FBI became no closer to taking down higher-ranking members of the Mexican Mafia for this murder. Due to the intense secrecy surrounding the group, even nearly 10 years of investigating yield no fruitful returns other than keeping two lower-level criminals behind bars for good. Unfortunately, it'll take much more police work, more crimes, and a good bit of luck to truly dismantle the Mexican Mafia for good in the future. A scarred and tattooed hand slides the bag of amphetamine across the table. The undercover cop's eyes settle on it. To everyone in the room, he's just another seasoned buyer, here to secure his next fix. Across the table, the dealer is confident in the product sitting between them. It's the best on the market, the kind of amphetamine that commands a high price. The cop's gaze lingers on the bag just a moment too long. There's a subtle shift in the air. The dealer notices. Suspicion creeps into his expression. The grin begins to fade. The cop knows the stakes. Hesitation could blow his cover or worse. Keeping his composure, he dabs a finger into the powder and presses it to his tongue. It's a calculated move, one designed to maintain the illusion. It isn't enough. The dealer's posture stiffens. He expects more, a true test of the product. This is the downside of being undercover. You have to do a lot of bad things all in the line of duty. Today, we'll take a look at the dangerous world of undercover work on this episode of the Infographics Show. Insane true stories from undercover cops. Number 6. The Speed Connoisseur. The receiver of the gift we just mentioned is Neil Woods, arguably Britain's most well-known undercover drugs cop. He befriended some of the nastiest people in England from 1993 to 2007, putting men behind bars collectively for over 1,000 years. He had arranged to meet a highly unstable local drug dealer in a bar, a notoriously dangerous bar. Woods had been working on this mark for a while, grooming him so he could get higher up the food chain and find out who the suppliers were. Just minutes earlier, at the other end of the bar, a man had been beaten senseless over a drug debt. The debt was a measly $15. That's all it took to send someone to the floor, blood pooling on the grimy tiles. Woods knew that if anyone in that place got so much as a whiff he was a cop, his next step would be the hospital. He had to take that speed, a drug he had never touched before. He joined the drug squad in his early 20s, diving headfirst into a world that demanded he become someone else. Before long, he was making friends with addicts in towns where his face wasn't known. It was the mid-90s and the British Home Office was concerned about rising drug use. It wasn't just speed and ecstasy in rave clubs, but addictive narcotics. For years, Neil Woods' life would revolve around coke, crack, and smack, a trio of drugs that fueled crime and desperation in Britain's most poverty-stricken neighborhoods. He was thrown into a world of violence and addiction, watching homeless addicts that he'd befriended dying of overdoses and hanging around no-go bars that maniacs made their home. One of those maniacs was the man telling him to take a hit of the powder he just slid across the table. He wasn't the kind of guy that he said no to, so Woods did as he was told. He indulged in Britain's finest speed. He later described the feeling as a white light, white heat rush. The dealer wasn't exaggerating. When the rest of that speed, pink champagne as it was called, was taken back to the lab, they found it was 40% pure. The average in England at the time was 5 to 7%. Woods spent the next 24 hours scrubbing every corner of his house. He didn't sleep for 3 nights, and then he came down like a crashed plane. These were early days of his undercover existence. It was a secret life that he wouldn't fully explain to his wife and kids, even to other cops, which was probably a good thing. He later found out that some of the cops in his town were on the payroll of some powerful drug dealers. And that's why when you work undercover, you tell no one. On one of Woods' jobs, he befriended a heroin dealer, a necessary but dangerous part of the role. One day, he knocked on the dealer's door only to be grabbed by the collar and hauled inside. Before he could process what was happening, he was face to face with the dealer, who brandished a samurai sword. The sharp steel edge was pressed against Woods' throat, and with spit flying out of his mouth, the dealer accused Woods of being drug squad. Woods was sure that his cover had been blown. The tension was broken when he heard someone laughing in the background. It was the dealer's girlfriend. The dealer cracked up too as he drew the sword away from Woods' neck. They'd just been trying to scare him. The woman, still in stitches, slapped her boyfriend on the back and said, "I thought he was actually going to say he was DS for a second." She might have been right. This was Woods' new world, and as he later said in an interview, every year went on, without fail, the people were more violent. In 2001, he very nearly became a victim of this escalating violence. He'd spent 6 months earning the trust of a high-level dealer, slowly working his way into the inner circle. Now he needed evidence, something concrete to bring the operation down. That meant getting this guy on camera, handing over the drugs. They arranged to meet after Woods had asked to score, and he assumed it would be a one-on-one deal. But when he arrived, there were 3 men waiting. 2 of them were complete strangers. On Woods' jacket was a tiny hidden camera disguised as a button. It was his only lifeline, and if anyone noticed it, he would be in big trouble. They met in a car park on an industrial estate outside of town. The guys got out of the car and took a big block of cocaine from the truck. One of the guys immediately became suspicious, and without warning, Woods was shoved hard against the wall. The guy's fingers started fiddling with the camera button, which Woods later said was not exactly James Bond quality. If he ran, he was dead. So not breaking character, he became incensed that someone would accuse him of being a cop. Pushing the guy away like he was about to hit him, The guy wasn't giving up, screaming to his mate that Woods was an undercover police. The dealer vouched for him, but Woods, still pretending to be upset, said he was going. He didn't need the drugs, not from someone accusing him like that. He started walking across the car park only to hear the padding of footsteps behind him. He was expecting a bullet in the back or a baseball bat across the head, but neither came. It was the guy he knew apologizing. He even gave Woods a big rock of crack as a peace offering. Over at the car, the guy was shouting at Woods that he was a cop. Woods was almost at the exit when he heard the sharp screech of tires. He didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. He was pretty sure the accuser had now managed to convince the others that he was in fact a cop. He glanced over his shoulder to see the car barreling toward him at high speed. At the last second, the car barely a meter away, Woods leaped over a barrier and ran for his life. A few hours later, he was back with the special operations team, and he told them his cover was blown. One of the team told him that the intel had revealed the men were armed. Woods knew he had a lucky escape. After all those years, he figured something out. The better the cops became at infiltrating gangs and getting snitches to talk, the nastier the gangs became. Their growing paranoia always led to an escalation of violence. Today, Woods is an outspoken advocate, fighting to end the war on drugs in the UK. It's a war that consumed years of his life, and one he knows can't be won. Very few people can do this job, and as you'll see now, those who can sometimes forget which side they're on. Number 5. Losing yourself. Keith Banks was a clean-cut 17-year-old kid when he joined the force in Australia. It was the late 70s and early 80s, and heroin addiction had become endemic in towns and cities across the country. Banks was idealistic. He wanted to change the world. So at 21, he grew out his hair, got a few piercings, and tried to infiltrate the gangs that were all doing the trafficking and dealing. Banks embraced this new identity, fully immersing himself in every second of his fabricated life. Before he went undercover, he never so much as smoked a cigarette. But within months of hanging out with the gangs, Banks was smoking cigs and weed and had taken to regular binge drinking. If he ever bumped into people he knew, his story was he'd been kicked out of the force for drug use. He spent every day of his life buying heroin, trying to move higher and higher up the distribution chain. Once a week, he would use a public payphone to call the drug squad and feed them back the information he gleaned. The hardest part was befriending people who, despite their involvement with drugs, he took a shine to. Banks was befriending lower-level guys, people he liked, and then he had to send them to prison. He became friends with many of them, even meeting their families. The line between reality and my underworld identity became blurred, he later said. It changed him. He became menacing and violent like the character he was playing. And it wasn't just when he was among other dealers. He was like that all the time. One of the men he hung out with was a double murderer who was wanted for escaping from prison. He was a very dangerous man. One night, Banks went to a nightclub with the dealer, blending seamlessly with his long hair and earrings. But as he approached the bar, he froze. The bartender recognized him and called out his name. They were old school friends. Banks felt his pulse quicken. Now more than ever, Banks had to become the maniac he'd been playing for so long. He started screaming and cursing, threatening the bartender for confusing him with someone else. He later said his dealer friend looked at him with penetrating, dark black, soulless eyes that reminded him of the serial killer Charles Manson. "He called you Keith," said the guy. "Why did he call you Keith?" Banks managed to talk his way out of it, or at least he thought he did. Sometime later, he walked into a flat in Brisbane to score drugs. As soon as the door closed behind him, one of the men in the room grabbed him and he felt the end of a shotgun against the side of his head. The man demanded that Banks do some lines of speed with the boys. It was a test, so Banks did as he was told, but still everyone looked suspicious. In another case, he spent the evening with a group of dealers as they talked about what they would do if they ever discovered someone they knew was undercover. The answer was torture and death. Unsurprisingly, when he finally resigned from the force, he was diagnosed with chronic PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Now let's look at a case where an undercover cop forgets he's a cop and goes rogue. Number 4. Cop Killer Cop. July 4th, 1995, Yuma, Arizona. Hurry up, he's shooting guns. He's firing rounds, hurry up! Those were the words of Yuma Police Lieutenant Dan Elkins to the operator on a 911 call. The operator barely had time to process them as the sound of gunshots erupted, followed by an ominous silence. Elkins, alongside Department of Public Safety Sergeant Mike Crow, had been cut down in the hail of bullets. The man who fired the gun was their colleague, a sheriff's deputy named Jack Hudson. Hudson had been working undercover for the Southwest Border Alliance Narcotics Task Force and had become a drug addict in the process. Elkins, Crow, and a technician had gone to the evidence room that evening to make sure everything was in order. Recently, there'd been a spate of mysterious thefts from the room, so they thought it was best to check. When they got there, they found Hudson standing beside broken safes and empty lockers, a 9mm weapon in his hand. None of the others were armed, but Hudson didn't give them a chance. He opened fire, killing 2 cops, before turning the gun on the technician, only for the gun to jam. In his addiction, Hudson had gone rogue, stealing drugs and weapons from the evidence room and selling the guns for more drugs. He was so high at the time of the murders, he later said he didn't even remember doing it. Still, he was clear-headed enough to put another round in his gun after Crow had pleaded, "Please don't shoot me again." Hudson fired into his head, killing him instantly. He was arrested outside in the car park. Detectives later went to his house and found amphetamines, methamphetamines, marijuana, and 18 firearms. He died in prison in 2017. Now let's look at what happens when undercovers befriend murderers. Number 3. The Habitual Confessor. June 6, 2012, Bristol, England. 32-year-old Claire Holland is knocking back drinks at Seamus O'Donnell's Irish pub in the city center. At approximately 11:15 p.m., she walks out the door and into the street. That's the last time anyone will see her, including her 4 children. Dive teams searched the harbor and police interviewed hundreds of people, but they couldn't find a body, and there was a lack of CCTV evidence. Without a body or witnesses, the case quickly went cold. Still, detectives had their suspicions, and high on the list was Darren Osmond, a 41-year-old chef battling a serious alcohol problem. He was also the father of one of Holland's 4 children. They had broken up years before she went missing, but he was still in her life. On the night she disappeared, they'd arranged to meet, but according to Osmond, she didn't show up. In 2019, he was on a night out in Devon, and in a drunken state, he called the police. He said that he couldn't handle the guilt anymore, and when the operator pressed him further, Osmond said he knew what had happened to Holland. Detectives were soon at his house. He was obviously still drunk when he admitted, "I gave some money to someone and they had her killed." But this wasn't the first time he'd confessed. In 2014, he told a roommate that he strangled Holland and had thrown her body into the Avonmouth docks, 9 miles outside of Bristol. Then, in 2018, he was drunk in a pub when he told a man he'd paid someone £500 to have Holland executed. So, there he was in 2019 confessing again, and again he was drunk. Unfortunately for the detectives, a drunken confession from an unstable, raging alcoholic is not usually enough to charge someone with a crime. The next morning, Osmond claimed he didn't remember making the phone call. Police knew Osmond was a violent man, someone capable of murder. After Holland gave birth to their child in 2008, the household spiraled into chaos. Alcohol-fueled domestic violence tore through their lives, leading to the child being taken into foster care. Though the two kept in touch over the years, their relationship was anything but amicable. Osmond harbored a simmering resentment, blaming Holland for their child's removal, a motive that couldn't be ignored. Police knew there was a good chance he was guilty, but with no evidence, they had to come up with a way for him to incriminate himself even further. That was about the time Patty O'Hara came onto the scene, a hard-drinking petty criminal barfly who had moved into an apartment not far from Osmond's place. O'Hara was a cop, whose real name remains a mystery to all but a chosen few. In 2020, O'Hara started hanging around the bars where Osmond was a regular drinker. He was new to the area and in need of new friends, and that's how he met Osmond. One of those first few nights out, Osmond told O'Hara he was struggling for money. "No problem," said O'Hara, he could find him some work moving boxes of counterfeit and stolen clothing. After that, they often met for 10-hour drinking sessions at O'Hara's flat, where they would kick back and watch soccer on the TV. O'Hara was perfect, turning into the kind of heavy drinker Osmond felt at home with. He became a lifesaver, often driving Osmond to his hospital appointments. As their relationship progressed, O'Hara began allowing Osmond to join him on his drug deals. Unknown to Osmond, the cannabis they were selling came directly from the evidence room and was being sold to another undercover officer. The whole point of this was to show Osmond that O'Hara was a lifetime criminal, to gain his trust and hopefully get him to talk about how he'd once gotten away with murder. But O'Hara was careful, never pushing Osmond too far, spending many nights talking about nothing and filling up 1,200 hours of secret recordings. Osmond fell for it. He began to love his new friend, who he'd come to treat like an all-weather ally. In October 2021, on one of the recordings, Osmond told O'Hara, "If I was getting married next week, you'd be my best man." It was around that time that Osment started to talk about his ex, Holland, who he said had vanished one night and was never seen again. He didn't admit to the murder, but he told O'Hara she ain't gonna be seeing the light of day again, don't worry about that. On another occasion, Osment said that he'd been having nightmares about Holland and her, quote, black eyes. It was almost as though she was haunting him, and that could be exploited. Sometimes at night, they'd take walks down by the estuary when Osment would hint that this was where he once dumped a body. Little by little, he opened up, once saying that the cops were putting the puzzle together but they haven't got all the bits. It wasn't until 2022 when O'Hara went in for the kill. He knew the murder was still troubling Osment psychologically, so one night he said he asked outright. He knew it was tearing Osment apart. Osment trusted O'Hara like a brother. He went into the details, explaining that he arranged to meet her that night, making sure to choose a spot where there wasn't any CCTV. He said it was easy. He just grabbed her and used what he said was his knife skills to cut her body. He said he weighed the body down so it would sink in the water, burned the clothes that he was wearing, and later put the knife in one of the other chef's kits. Osment said he felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. O'Hara, always the perfect undercover, gave him a warm smile. That was the last time the two best friends met each other. In court, Osment's defense tried to argue that plying a man with booze and coaxing him into what they said was a false confession was unfair, but the evidence stood and Osment received a life sentence. In 2024, he launched an appeal, but it's unlikely that'll make any difference. Okay, so what happens when you cross a murderer with a group of fake hardcore gangsters? Number 2. A friend to gangsters. February 27, 1999, 12:45 a.m. 17-year-old Michelle Bright is last seen leaving a party of a 15-year-old friend in the small town of Goolgong in Australia's New South Wales Central West. Her badly beaten body is soon found near train tracks less than a mile away from her parents' house. The pathologist will say she died from homicidal violence of an undetermined etiology. It was a heinous crime that stunned the nation, prompting authorities to offer a huge $500,000 reward. By 2020, the reward was doubled to $1 million, reflecting the desperate urgency to solve the case. Goolgong was a tiny town, only home to 2,500 people. If the killer was local, which police suspected, then he should be fairly easy to find. They followed thousands of leads. They interviewed pretty much everyone in the town, but the one guy they missed was Craig Rumsby. The meat transport worker left town for the outskirts of Sydney about 2 weeks after the murder. The case went cold but was reopened in 2019. Detectives had a list of suspects, and now one of them was Rumsby. They'd already questioned him, but they didn't have enough to charge him. They needed to ensnare him, and knowing how impressionable he was, it was decided they'd introduce him to some high-level gangsters who were secretly undercover policemen. One night, a couple of these guys got to talking to Rumsby. They told him they needed a guy to help out with a job, and it was good money. They spent months after that grooming him, becoming his closest friend, thrilling him with dark tales from the underworld. In 2020, they introduced him to someone who they said was a corrupt cop on their payroll. If Rumsby had anything that needed fixing, this cop could do it for him. Rumsby had told him the cops had once tried to, quote, pin a murder on him, the murder of Michelle Bright, but he denied doing it. So 5 months later, his gang member buddies said they'd gotten word from their police contacts that the cops were now actively looking at him and that his name had come up in some case. One of the gangsters stressed that Rumsby was part of the family. He was a brother. But there was a catch. Loyalty came with conditions, and they couldn't afford any heat on them. The situation needed to be fixed. Rumsby played dumb, saying nothing. Later, one of the guys sent him a text explaining that this case his name had come up in was a murder that happened years ago out west. Rumsby texted back, adamantly denying any involvement. He insisted Bright was like a sister to him, a bond forged from growing up together. Again, the trap had failed. Rumsby had indeed known the victim. His house back then wasn't that far from her place. He made out that he'd been a friend to her. So after the authorities wrote a Facebook post about the new reward of $1 million, he wrote in the comments section, "It's so sad they haven't caught her killer. Michelle was like a sister to me. I feel sorry for the family." The next day, he was called to a hotel to speak with the big boss of the gang, a guy he'd rarely seen in the flesh. The boss said, "Look, if your name is connected to this murder, that brings heat on the family." He demanded honesty from Rumsby, otherwise they couldn't work together. Rumsby still didn't budge, saying that he knew nothing about the murder, so the cops moved to the next part of the plan. The boss approached Rumsby again, this time with copies of police documents he supposedly gotten from his corrupt law enforcement mates. There were records about Rumsby, including a photo of a red Ford Falcon car. They were onto him, said the boss. It was just a matter of time before they got him. Back in 1999, after police had interviewed Rumsby on the phone about the murder, that same car was found in flames. The cops said the boss knew that Rumsby had driven it that night and had later destroyed it. The boss told him again that if he told the truth, they could get him out of this. Rumsby paused for a minute and then said one night he was out late near his house and he heard footsteps behind him. He looked back and it was his young neighbor, Michelle. He walked over to her, grabbed her, and put his hand over her mouth until she stopped breathing. The boss was skeptical, but Rumsby was adamant. He was telling the truth. He explained that that night he'd been driving around in his Falcon when he stopped at the commercial hotel to speak to the publican. He then set off walking, and that's when he heard those footsteps. The boss said they needed to get this straight if they were going to get the cops off his tail. He needed to take them to Gulgong and show them exactly where he'd killed the girl. After that, said the boss, they would charter a private plane and fly him to another town where he could lay low until the heat died down. Night had already fallen when Rumsby took them to Barney's Reef Road in Gulgong, and that's where he had killed her and dragged her body over the road, pushing it into the scrub so no one would find it. He explained that when he went home, he had a beer, took a shower, washed his clothes, and went to bed. He told the guys when it was on the TV for the next 12 months, all he could think was, "What have I done?" As promised, they took him straight to the airport, but instead of finding a private plane waiting for him, there were a bunch of police officers and a pair of shiny handcuffs. His best friends handed him over. In court, aged 56, Rumsby was sentenced to 32 years in prison with a minimum of 24 years. Okay, here's an undercover cop story like no other. Number 1. The Perfect Assassin. Future undercover assassin extraordinaire Gary Johnson grew up in the 50s in a small town in Louisiana. After serving in the Vietnam War as a military police officer, he returned to Louisiana to work at the sheriff's office. A few years later, he was embedded as an undercover cop in Port Arthur, Texas. There, he lived a double life, posing as a drug addict to gain the trust of street dealers and set them up for arrests. As with all undercover cops, Johnson had a knack for acting. He was what you might call a character, the last guy you would expect to be carrying a badge. After his stint as a fake addict, he earned himself a master's degree in psychology and intended to get a PhD in psychology from the University of Houston. But then, he got a call from the Houston District Attorney's Office. His initial job involved reviewing videotapes of crimes and confessions, preparing them for prosecutors. But his success as an undercover drugs cop, combined with his sharp psychological acumen, set him on a very different path. It was decided that he would take on a new role, becoming Texas's most renowned contract killer. Informants helped the cops in spreading the word that the character Johnson was pretending to be was the greatest professional hitman in Houston. If you needed murder for hire, he was the man to call. Word on the street was no one did killing better. Satisfaction and security were guaranteed. It wasn't long until he had customers. He employed his powers of psychology to come across as believable, changing character for each person who would meet him and tell him why and how someone needed to die. If he was taking out a gangster, Johnson became a tough-looking biker. If the hit was a businessman, he would be a business-like assassin. For a wealthy woman who wanted her husband dead, he was a friendly-looking guy who was a good listener. He could turn into whatever he needed to be in whichever situation he found himself in. Rich, poor, educated, uneducated, dangerous, smart, stupid, Johnson was always able to become the perfect-looking assassin. But his weapon of choice wasn't a gun, it was a wire, hidden in his shirt, and it sent a lot of people to prison. He started his gig in 1989, and over the next 30 years he put over 60 of his clients behind bars. Johnson's colleagues said he was the chillest dude imaginable. He had a good heart, too. One time a woman hired him to whack her violent boyfriend. When Johnson found out this guy regularly beat her, instead of sending her to prison, he put her in touch with social service agencies. He also found her a therapist and got her a place in a women's shelter. The defense in the trials would usually say Johnson manipulated his clients into requesting a murder, but he didn't see it that way. He once said, "That's all my job is, to help people open up, to get them to say what they really want, to reveal to me their deepest desires." He never killed anyone, but there is no doubt that Gary Johnson was the greatest fake hitman the world has ever seen. Which of these insane cop stories blew your mind the most? Was there one that left you speechless or had you on the edge of your seat? Let us know in the comments below.